I drained my life savings to pay my mother's $27,000 hospital bill. But when my chest tightened and I collapsed onto their hardwood floor, gasping for air, my parents rolled their eyes and accused me of faking it for attention. It was not until minutes later, when the emergency room doctor pulled my parents out of the room, sneaked back in and whispered, "This did not start tonight," that I realized the horrifying truth. I was being hunted by the people who gave me life. Welcome back to the channel. If you think you know how evil family can be, trust me, you have not heard anything yet. Before we expose these absolute monsters, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us which city you are watching from right now. Let us get into it. My name is Clara. I am 42 years old, and I have spent the last 15 years grinding 60-hour weeks as an independent real estate broker in a brutally competitive market. I am talking about skipping meals, showing houses on Thanksgiving, and dealing with impossible clients just to build a life for myself. I was finally about to close on my dream home. I had $28,000 sitting in a high-yield savings account, earmarked entirely for my down payment. It was my ticket to peace and stability. But family always comes first, right? That is what my mother Beatrice always drilled into my head during Sunday sermons. So there I was, sitting in a sterile, over-air-conditioned Chase Bank branch on a Tuesday morning, staring at a wire transfer authorization form that felt like a death warrant for my future. The bank teller, a sweet, older woman named Linda, looked over her glasses at me with genuine concern. She asked if I was absolutely sure I wanted to authorize the transfer. $27,000 is a massive amount of money to move all at once, and once it is wired, it is gone forever. I swallowed the thick lump in my throat and nodded. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the blue pen they provided. I told her I had absolutely no choice. My mother had just undergone emergency heart bypass surgery. According to my father, Richard, her Medicare and supplemental insurance completely denied the claim due to some catastrophic complicated paperwork error. The hospital billing department was allegedly threatening to send the debt to aggressive collections and put a lien on my parents' house. I signed the paper. With one stroke of that pen, 15 years of skipped vacations, late-night showings, and eating cold takeout in my car vanished into thin air. The money was gone. It was transferred directly to a joint account my parents set up specifically to handle the medical expenses. Walking out of that bank, I felt violently sick to my stomach. A deep, gnawing exhaustion was settling deep into my bones. I had not slept more than 3 hours a night since I got the frantic phone call about her heart. I was running entirely on black coffee, pure adrenaline, and daughterly obligation managing my client listings from uncomfortable plastic hospital waiting room chairs while my mother supposedly recovered. But I did it because she was my mother. I loved her, and I genuinely thought she loved me. You might be wondering where my brother was during all of this financial panic. Allow me to introduce Preston. Preston is 38 years old, the undisputed golden child of our family, and a man who has quite literally never faced a single consequence in his entire life. While I was sitting in that bank emptying my life savings, Preston was running his fourth failed tech startup out of a rented luxury loft downtown. He always seemed to have endless cash for tailored suits, imported scotch, and lease payments on a European sports car he had no business driving. But the very second my mother got sick and the hospital bills piled up, his pockets mysteriously turned completely inside out. When the $27,000 bill dropped on our heads, my father did not ask Preston for a single dime. Instead, Richard called me. His voice was dripping with that heavy, weaponized guilt only a parent can master. He told me Preston was under entirely too much stress with his startup. He said Preston was building an empire and could not be distracted by family financial burdens right now. I, on the other hand, was the single, unmarried daughter with no children and no husband to consult. According to my parents' twisted logic, my money was disposable. My future was entirely secondary. It was my duty as a good Christian daughter to step up to the plate and save the family from ruin. Preston did show up to the hospital, of course. He would stroll in for exactly 20 minutes at a time, holding a pathetic bouquet of cheap gas station flowers, kissing my mother on the cheek, and telling her she looked beautiful. She would immediately light up like a Christmas tree, stroking his hand, and calling him her brave, successful boy. Then he would look at me, his eyes perfectly feigning exhaustion, and say he was praying so hard for our family. He offered me absolutely nothing but empty thoughts and meaningless prayers before rushing right back out the door, claiming he had an urgent high-stakes meeting with wealthy investors. I swallowed my bitter resentment. I bit my tongue so hard it bled. I told myself it did not matter. The bill was paid. My mother was safe. We could finally put this horrible nightmare behind us. I left the bank parking lot that morning feeling completely hollowed out, but profoundly relieved. I thought the worst was finally over. I thought my massive financial sacrifice meant something real to them. I had absolutely no idea that wiring that money was just the opening move in a sick, twisted game. I was utterly blind to the horrifying reality that my own hard-earned money had just funded my own destruction. The physical toll of the last few weeks was finally catching up to my body. My chest felt unusually tight all the time, and a strange, bitter, metallic taste had been lingering in the back of my throat for days. I ignored the symptoms, chalking it up to pure stress and exhaustion. That Sunday, my parents invited us over for a big family dinner to celebrate my mother coming home and recovering. I dragged my exhausted, aching body to their house, completely unaware that I was walking straight into a deadly trap. The smell of roasted rosemary and garlic hit me the second I pushed open the heavy oak front door of my parents' colonial home. It was supposed to be a celebratory Sunday dinner, a grand family gathering to honor my mother Beatrice and her miraculous recovery from her supposed emergency heart surgery. I stepped into the foyer and could already hear the clinking of expensive crystal and the loud, booming laughter of my brother Preston coming from the formal dining room. I felt like a walking corpse. My legs were heavy, my joints ached with every step, and that strange metallic bitterness I had been ignoring all week was now coating the entire back of my throat. I forced a smile onto my face, plastered on some expensive foundation to hide the dark circles under my eyes, and walked into the dining room to take my seat. Beatrice was holding court at the head of the pristine mahogany table. She looked absolutely radiant, completely untouched by the traumatic medical ordeal she claimed had nearly ended her life. She was wearing a silk blouse and sipping sparkling water animatedly, recounting how brave she had been in the hospital. Richard, my father, sat to her right, nodding along with absolute devotion. Preston was slouched in his chair, swirling a glass of red wine, looking bored, but nodding whenever my mother paused for applause. No one asked how I was doing. No one mentioned the massive $27,000 hole in my bank account. They simply expected me to sit there past the mashed potatoes and be grateful that I was allowed to witness their perfect family dynamic. I tried to swallow a small bite of the roast beef, but it felt like dry ash in my mouth. A wave of profound nausea washed over me. I reached for my water glass, hoping the cold liquid would clear the sudden fog rolling into my brain. But as my fingers wrapped around the condensation on the glass, a sharp, terrifying pain shot directly through the center of my chest. It felt as though an invisible, heavy iron band had been suddenly wrapped around my ribs and pulled tight. I gasped, dropping the water glass. It shattered against the polished hardwood floor, sending water and shards of ice flying everywhere. The conversation at the table stopped. My mother frowned, letting out a loud, theatrical sigh of pure annoyance. I tried to apologize, to say I would clean it up, but the words never made it out of my mouth. My throat closed. The airway simply vanished. I opened my mouth to pull in a breath, but nothing happened. Panic, raw and primal, exploded inside my chest. I pushed my chair back frantically, trying to stand up, but my knees immediately buckled. The room spun in a violent circle, and I crashed hard onto the solid wood floor, my shoulder hitting the leg of the dining table on the way down. I lay there on my side, staring at the baseboards, my mouth open like a fish out of water. I was suffocating. Every instinct in my body screamed for oxygen, my lungs burning with an agonizing fire. I clawed at the collar of my shirt, desperate to relieve the pressure, but it was useless. I managed to roll onto my back, my vision beginning to blur at the edges, looking up at the people who were supposed to love me. I expected panic. I expected my father to shout for an ambulance. I expected my brother to drop to his knees and help me. Instead, Beatrice looked down at me from her chair, her face twisted in a mask of absolute disgust. She crossed her arms over her silk blouse and scoffed loudly. She actually scoffed. She looked at my father and said in a harsh, cold tone that it was unbelievable I would pull a stunt like this on her special day. My brain could barely process the words through the lack of oxygen, but the sheer malice in her voice cut through the ringing in my ears. I reached a trembling hand up toward my father, a silent plea for my life. Richard just stared at me, his jaw set in anger. He pointed a finger at my struggling body and told me in a firm, disciplinary voice to stop being so dramatic. He said I was acting like a petulant child and demanded I get up off the floor immediately before I ruined the antique rug. The darkness was creeping in fast now. The edges of the room were dissolving into black shadows. My chest was heaving in violent, silent spasms, trying to force air through a completely paralyzed windpipe. Then came the absolute worst moment of all. Preston pushed his chair back. He stood up tall and healthy and casually walked around the table. He did not kneel beside me. He did not check my pulse. He literally stepped directly over my convulsing legs to reach the serving platter in the center of the table. I watched his expensive leather shoes clear my knees as he grabbed the serving fork, stabbing another thick slice of roast beef. He chuckled a low, mean laugh, telling our parents to just ignore me. He casually mentioned that I was obviously jealous of the attention Beatrice was getting, and that I was faking a panic attack to make her recovery all about myself. He told them to let me throw my little tantrum on the floor while they finished their meal. I was dying. I was actually dying right there in their dining room, and they were annoyed by the inconvenience. The realization hit me with more force than the physical pain. I was completely on my own. I forced my numb fingers into the pocket of my slacks and pulled out my cell phone. My vision was almost entirely gone, reduced to a tiny pinprick of blurry light. Relying purely on muscle memory, I pressed the side button rapidly to activate the emergency shortcut. I heard the faint, tiny voice of a dispatcher answering from the phone speaker clutched in my weak hand. I could not speak. I could only manage one final desperate tapping noise against the phone screen before the blackness finally rushed in and swallowed me whole, leaving my family to enjoy their dinner while my heart slowly stopped beating. The blinding fluorescent lights of the emergency room burned through my closed eyelids before I even realized I was still alive. A steady, rhythmic beeping echoed in my ears, cutting through the lingering fog in my brain. My throat felt raw, like I had swallowed a handful of crushed glass, and a heavy oxygen mask was strapped tightly to my face. As I slowly peeled my eyes open, the blurry shapes around me began to sharpen into focus. The sterile smell of rubbing alcohol and bleached hospital linens flooded my senses. I tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot down my left arm, where a thick intravenous line was taped to my skin. I was alive. The paramedics had somehow reached me in time to pull me back from the edge of absolute darkness. But the profound relief of surviving was instantly shattered the moment I turned my head and saw the 3 people sitting at the foot of my narrow hospital bed. My mother, Beatrice, was clutching a damp tissue to her chest, dabbing at completely dry eyes. She was leaning forward with a look of manufactured terror plastered across her face. My father, Richard, stood right behind her, with a protective hand resting on her shoulder, playing the stoic patriarch, holding his family together through a terrible crisis. And Preston, my brother, was slouched in a plastic visitor chair, miraculously managing to look deeply traumatized, despite his complete lack of actual physical or emotional effort. A young, exhausted-looking nurse with kind eyes was adjusting the monitors above my head. The moment she noticed I was awake, Beatrice leaped out of her chair with an agility that completely defied her supposedly fragile heart condition. She rushed to my side and grabbed my hand, squeezing it so hard her fingernails dug painfully into my knuckles. She cried out, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical emotion, praising the heavens that her precious girl was finally awake. She claimed they had been praying for hours without a single break. The nurse smiled warmly at them, clearly moved by the flawless performance. She turned to me and said I was incredibly lucky to have such a devoted family by my side, and that they had not left my room for a single second since the ambulance arrived. I stared at the nurse, unable to speak through the thick plastic mask, I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her they had stepped over my dying body to eat roast beef. I wanted to shake her and tell her she was looking at a room full of monsters. But I was trapped in my own failing body, entirely at their mercy. The nurse patted my leg gently and told my parents she was going to check on my blood work and find the attending physician. She advised me to rest quietly and keep the oxygen mask securely on my face. The second the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind her, the temperature in the room plummeted. The warm, loving smiles vanished from their faces with terrifying speed. It was like watching a heavy, velvet curtain drop on a Broadway stage right after the final bow. Beatrice immediately dropped my hand as if my skin was infected with a deadly plague, and began frantically wiping her own palms with an antibacterial wipe from her expensive leather purse. She took 2 deliberate steps back from the bed, smoothing out the wrinkles in her silk blouse, her face twisting back into that familiar mask of bitter disgust. Richard crossed his arms over his chest and glared down at me from the foot of the bed. He did not ask how I was feeling, or if I was in any physical pain. He did not ask what had caused my airway to suddenly completely close up. Instead, he demanded to know if I had any idea how much an emergency ambulance ride cost in this particular county. He coldly informed me that they were forced to leave a perfectly good Sunday dinner, completely ruined, and drive all the way down to this filthy public hospital just to keep up appearances for the neighbors. Beatrice chimed in, her voice dripping with absolute venom. She accused me of being unbelievably selfish for throwing a desperate tantrum on the exact day the family was supposed to be celebrating her miraculous recovery. She said I had always been intensely jealous of any attention that was not focused entirely on my own life and career. Preston let out a loud, arrogant laugh from the dark corner of the room. He walked over to his bed, pulled his expensive smartphone out of his pocket, and began scrolling through his emails. He did not even bother to look at me when he spoke. He casually mentioned that the paramedics told them my oxygen levels were critically low, but he was utterly convinced I had just hyperventilated on purpose to punish them for asking for the $27,000. He told our parents I was probably just stressed about being a middle-aged single woman with no real romantic prospects, and that my little panic attack was a pathetic, desperate cry for help. I lay there frozen under the thin hospital blanket, listening to the people I shared DNA with mock my near-death experience. The heavy realization settled over me like a suffocating weighted blanket. They were not just annoyed by my presence. They fundamentally despised me. They viewed my very existence as a frustrating burden and treated my bank account as their own personal property. In their eyes, I was nothing more than an ATM machine that had suddenly decided to break down and cause an embarrassing scene. I did not shed a single tear. I did not try to defend myself or explain the terrifying reality of suffocating on their dining room floor while they ate their meal. The naive, devoted daughter who emptied her life savings account for them died on that hardwood floor. In that sterile hospital room, listening to their cruel, relentless laughter, something inside my soul permanently broke. The fear evaporated. The guilt was completely gone. I closed my eyes and let them continue their hateful ranting, silently promising myself that I would make them pay for every single word. The heavy wooden door of my hospital room swung open, pushing away the toxic atmosphere my family had just created. A tall man in his late 50s wearing a crisp white coat stepped into the room holding a digital tablet. His name tag read, Dr. Harrison. He had sharp, observant eyes that immediately swept across the room, taking in my mother and her fake, tragic posture, my father standing in his defensive stance, and my brother showing his complete apathy. He looked down at his screen and then back at me, his expression unreadable but intensely focused. Beatrice immediately launched into her exhausting performance again, wailing about how terrified she was for her fragile daughter. She begged the doctor to tell her what was wrong with my lungs, claiming I had never had a single health issue before today. Dr. Harrison did not smile. He did not offer her the comforting platitudes she was so clearly fishing for. Instead, he simply stated that my condition was highly complex and required absolute silence and rest. He turned to my parents and brother with an authoritative tone that left absolutely no room for argument. He told them he needed to run a few more specialized scans and that they would have to leave the emergency department entirely for the next hour. My father immediately bristled, arguing that as my family, they had every right to stay. But Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his voice dropping an octave, and informed Richard that hospital policy strictly prohibited visitors during this specific phase of critical assessment. He practically ordered them down to the first-floor cafeteria. Preston huffed in extreme annoyance, complaining loudly about the terrible coffee downstairs, while Beatrice shot me one last look of pure resentment before wrapping her silk scarf around her neck. They filed out of the room one by one. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, and the overwhelming silence that followed felt like a physical weight lifting off my chest. I closed my eyes, finally able to breathe without their suffocating presence. But the silence only lasted for exactly 3 minutes. The door handle turned slowly without a single sound. I opened my eyes, expecting to see a nurse returning to check my intravenous line. Instead, Dr. Harrison slipped quietly back into the room. He did not turn on the main overhead lights. He walked over to the door and deliberately locked it from the inside. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The professional, detached demeanor he had displayed in front of my family was completely gone. He pulled a small, rolling stool right up to the edge of my bed and sat down, leaning in so close I could see the deep worry lines etched around his eyes. He tapped the screen of his tablet, pulling up a series of complex charts, highlighted in bright red, and angled the device so I could see the screen. I could not understand the medical jargon, but I understood the color red meant severe danger. He looked over his shoulder toward the locked door, then leaned in closer and lowered his voice to a bare whisper. "Clara," he said, his tone dead serious, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You did not have a severe asthma attack tonight. You did not have a random allergic reaction." He pointed a steady finger at the highest red bar on the screen. "We ran a comprehensive toxicology panel when you were admitted because your symptoms did not align with a standard respiratory failure. Your blood work came back showing extremely dangerous, highly toxic levels of a very specific chemical compound. It is a rare industrial solvent. It is the kind of powerful chemical used in heavy manufacturing to strip paint and grease off metal parts." He paused, letting the terrifying reality of his words hang in the dim room. Then he delivered the chilling line that would permanently alter the course of my life. This did not start tonight. My heart began to pound a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the impossible information. Dr. Harrison continued explaining that this specific solvent is tasteless in small doses, but leaves a distinct, bitter, metallic residue in the mouth as it builds up in the human body. He told me that someone had been slowly, methodically introducing this poison into my system for at least the past 3 weeks. The chemical was designed to mimic the exact symptoms of a severe, cascading respiratory failure. It attacks the central nervous system and paralyzes the diaphragm. If the paramedics had arrived even 2 minutes later, my heart would have completely stopped, and any standard autopsy would have likely ruled it a tragic, sudden asthma attack. He looked me dead in the eyes and told me the terrifying truth. Someone was intentionally trying to murder me, and they were trying to make it look like natural causes. The sterile hospital room seemed to tilt violently on its axis. My blood ran completely cold. A sudden, vivid montage of the past 3 weeks flashed through my mind, like a terrifying horror movie. The bitter taste in my morning coffee that Beatrice insisted on brewing for me when she came over to complain about her medical bills. The sudden, inexplicable tightness in my chest that started the exact same week my father demanded the $27,000 wire transfer. The way Preston joked about my empty house and my lack of heirs just hours before I collapsed. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. They did not just want my savings. They wanted absolutely everything. They wanted my lucrative real estate business, my comprehensive life insurance policy, my newly purchased dream home, and my remaining bank accounts. And the only way they could get all of it without a legal fight was if I was permanently out of the picture. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling a profound, terrifying calm wash over my entire body. The panic was gone. The confusion evaporated. The desperate, pleading daughter, who just wanted her family to love her, was officially dead, buried under the toxic ash of their unspeakable betrayal. Dr. Harrison asked me softly if I had any idea who would want to do this to me. He pulled out his cell phone, offering to call the police right that very second to have them arrested in the cafeteria. I slowly turned my head to look at him. A dark, icy resolve settled deep into my bones. The people who gave me life were actively trying to take it away. They thought I was weak. They thought I was completely blind to their greed. But they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I shook my head, my voice finally finding its strength, and whispered back that I did not want him to call the police just yet. I needed more time to set the perfect trap. The helpless victim was gone forever. The hunter had just woken up. The metallic click of the hospital room door locking behind Dr. Harrison felt like the heavy final nail sealing the coffin of my past life. I was entirely alone in the quiet, dim space, but the silence was completely deafening. A violent storm of adrenaline and absolute terror raged inside my veins, pumping pure survival instinct into my freezing hands. My own mother and father, along with my golden child brother, were actively orchestrating my murder. They were not just draining my bank accounts or taking advantage of my blind kindness. They were methodically feeding me industrial poison and waiting for me to suffocate to death on their dining room floor so they could inherit my entire real estate empire. I stared at the blank white ceiling tile above my hospital bed, forcing myself to take slow, measured breaths through the thick, plastic oxygen mask. Panic was a luxury I could absolutely no longer afford. If I called the police right now, as the kind doctor had eagerly suggested, I would have nothing but a complex blood test and a wild theory. My family would immediately hire high-priced defense attorneys, using the very money they stole from me to defend themselves. They would play the devastated victims. They would tell the police I was a hysterical, overworked spinster who accidentally ingested toxic chemicals at one of my dusty construction sites. I needed irrefutable, ironclad proof. I needed to catch them in the absolute act with zero room for denial. To do that, I had to become the greatest actress the world had ever seen. I had to embrace the strategic silence. I closed my eyes and began to meticulously construct my new persona. The strong, independent real estate broker, who had just emptied her life savings to wire them $27,000, was officially dead. In her place, I needed to present a pathetic, fragile woman who was completely broken by stress and utterly dependent on her loving family for survival. I reached up with trembling fingers and adjusted the thin hospital blanket, pulling it tightly up to my chin to make my body look as small and frail as possible in the massive mechanical bed. I let my facial muscles completely relax, drooping my eyelids and allowing a hollow, vacant expression of pure exhaustion to settle over my features. I focused intensely on the bitter metallic taste still lingering heavily on the back of my tongue, using that disgusting chemical flavor to fuel the agonizing performance I was about to give. I lay there listening to the steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor, calculating my exact next moves. When the heavy wooden door finally creaked open again, exactly 1 hour later, I was ready for them. I did not turn my head immediately. I waited patiently for them to step fully into the sterile room before letting out a weak, pathetic groan. Beatrice was the first one to reach my bedside. She carried a fresh hot coffee in a paper cup from the downstairs cafeteria, and she wore a perfectly manufactured expression of deep maternal worry. Richard trailed closely behind her, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his expensive navy blue slacks, scanning the glowing medical monitors above my head as if he actually understood what the flashing numbers meant. Preston lingered lazily by the door, leaning against the heavy wooden doorframe, with his arms crossed over his chest, looking like he would rather be literally anywhere else on the planet right now. Beatrice reached out and stroked my sweaty forehead with her cold, clammy hand. Her sudden touch made my stomach violently churn with pure disgust, but I forced myself to lean directly into it, letting out a soft sigh of manufactured relief. She asked me in a sickly sweet, trembling voice what the doctor had found, and if her poor, precious baby was going to be all right. I kept my eyes half closed, staring up at the smiling woman who had birthed me and was now actively trying to bury me. I let a few silent, genuine tears well up in the corners of my eyes, allowing them to spill over and run slowly down my pale cheeks. I made my voice shake, adopting a raspy, pathetic whisper that cracked with raw emotion. I told them Dr. Harrison had run every possible diagnostic test and completed all the extensive blood work. I paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough to see a sudden sharp flash of genuine panic cross my father's rigid face. He held his breath, terrified the game was up. Then I dropped the massive lie. I told them the doctor firmly concluded it was just a massive catastrophic panic attack triggered by severe prolonged stress combined with an extremely rare allergic reaction to something strange I had eaten earlier that week. I blamed my own endless exhaustion and my weak nervous system. I apologized profusely, crying harder now for ruining their beautiful Sunday dinner and causing such an embarrassing, dramatic scene at the family house. I said I was just so overwhelmed by my demanding real estate clients and so deeply worried about my mother's recent heart surgery that my body simply shut down under the immense mental pressure. The shift in the room was immediate and absolutely chilling to witness. The heavy, thick tension of fear that had walked in with them instantly evaporated into the cold air. Richard let out a loud, dramatic sigh of profound relief, letting his tense shoulders completely drop. He walked over to the bed and patted my leg through the thin blanket, telling me condescendingly that I needed to learn how to manage my volatile emotions better and stop overreacting to simple, daily life challenges. Preston actually laughed out loud. It was a cruel, mocking sound that echoed harshly off the sterile hospital walls. He pulled his expensive smartphone out of his pocket and started typing loudly, muttering that I had wasted everyone's entire Sunday afternoon over a simple, pathetic panic attack. But it was Beatrice who gave away the absolute most. As I watched her closely through my half-open, blurry eyes, I saw her carefully constructed mask slip for one single, terrifying second. When she heard I was going to survive, and that the medical staff suspected absolutely nothing, her face did not show a mother's joy. A dark, fleeting shadow of profound, bitter disappointment passed right over her eyes. Her mouth tightened into a frustrated, angry, thin line before she quickly recovered and forced another fake, loving smile onto her face. She leaned down close to my ear and kissed my cheek, whispering softly that she would take excellent care of me when I finally got home. She promised to make all my daily meals from scratch and ensure I took all my necessary medications on time so I could recover properly without lifting a single finger. The sheer arrogant audacity of her words sent a freezing physical chill straight down my spine. She was openly promising to continue feeding me industrial poison right to my face, completely convinced I was entirely clueless and fully under her control. I squeezed her hand back tightly, putting every ounce of fake, desperate love I could muster into the gentle gesture. I told her I could not possibly survive without her constant help and guidance. I played the grateful, naive victim flawlessly, feeding their massive inflated egos and their twisted, sick sense of absolute control. They thought they had successfully navigated a minor, annoying bump in their grand, murderous plan. They fully believed I was just a weak, pathetic obstacle they would soon eliminate entirely from their perfect lives. But as I lay there silently watching my brother text his friends, and my parents whisper secretively to each other near the window, the terrified, helpless daughter finally died for good. She was permanently replaced by a cold, calculating predator who was about to systematically dismantle their entire lives piece by bloody piece. The afternoon sun was filtering through the expensive plantation shutters of my master bedroom, casting long, golden shadows across the hardwood floor. I was finally back in my own house, safely tucked under my high thread-count duvet. My parents had practically carried me inside, putting on an elaborate show of profound parental concern for the benefit of my nosy neighbors. Beatrice had fluffed my pillows, poured me a glass of ice water that I absolutely did not drink, and promised to return first thing in the morning to prepare a special healing breakfast. As soon as I heard the heavy deadbolt click into place and their car engine fade down the suburban street, I threw off the heavy blankets. My hands were no longer shaking with fear. They were trembling with pure, unadulterated rage. I walked over to my home office desk and grabbed my silver laptop, carrying it back to the bed like a weapon. The first rule of being a top-tier real estate broker is that you never, ever take a transaction at face value. You always verify the paperwork. For the past month, I had been entirely too exhausted and emotionally manipulated to look closely at the documentation surrounding my mother's catastrophic health crisis. I had just blindly trusted them. That profound mistake was about to be corrected. I propped the pillows against the headboard and flipped the laptop open. Because I was the responsible daughter, I was the one who had set up my mother's online patient portal for the regional hospital network years ago. I knew her username and her password. I navigated to the billing and records section, expecting to see a mountain of denied claims from cardiologists and surgical teams. I clicked on the tab labeled Recent Procedures and held my breath. The screen loaded in a fraction of a second. I stared at the glowing blue text, reading the lines over and over again until the words lost all meaning. There was absolutely no record of a heart bypass surgery. There was no emergency cardiac unit admission. There was no team of highly specialized surgeons fighting to save her life. The only medical entry for the entire month was a simple, minor outpatient procedure. Beatrice had undergone a routine endoscopy with a local gastroenterologist. She had a bleeding stomach ulcer. That was it. An ulcer caused by her own terrible diet and constant whining. I clicked on the financial breakdown for the visit. The total cost of the procedure was $1,200, and Medicare had covered all but a tiny $75 copay. A sick, hollow laugh bubbled up from the very bottom of my throat. My mother had not been hovering near the edge of death. She had been taking naps in a recovery bay for 3 hours before walking out completely fine. The entire terrifying saga about failing heart valves and aggressive debt collectors was a meticulously fabricated script. But if the hospital never asked for $27,000, then where exactly did my entire house down payment go? I opened a new browser tab and logged into my own banking portal. When my father originally demanded the money, he insisted I wire it directly to a new joint account he had specifically opened under both of our names to easily manage my mother's incoming medical expenses and avoid any complicated gift tax issues. He thought he was being incredibly clever, but he had completely forgotten that having my name on the account meant I still had full legal access to view its transaction history. I typed in my credentials and pulled up the ledger for that specific joint account. There it was. My massive deposit of $27,000 hitting the account on that Tuesday morning. But the money did not stay there for weeks, negotiating with hospital billing departments. According to the digital timestamp, my life savings sat in that joint account for exactly 14 minutes. It was then immediately split into 2 separate outbound wire transfers. I traced the routing numbers with cold mechanical precision using the same skip tracing software I used to verify shady real estate buyers. The first wire was for $12,000. The destination was not a medical facility. It went directly to the United States Department of the Treasury. Specifically, it was routed to an Internal Revenue Service collections division. The second wire, for $15,000, was sent to a prominent legal firm in Las Vegas that specialized in aggressive debt recovery for high-stakes private casinos. The final, brutal pieces of the puzzle violently slammed into place, forming a picture so ugly it actually took my breath away. This had absolutely nothing to do with my mother's health. This was entirely about the golden child. Preston had not just failed at another tech startup. He had completely destroyed his life. He had racked up massive federal tax liens and severe gambling debts. He was staring down the barrel of federal tax evasion charges and likely a few broken kneecaps from his casino creditors. My parents knew their precious boy was about to face real devastating consequences for the very first time in his pampered life, so they simply decided to steal my future to buy back his freedom. They invented a fake heart condition. They weaponized my love and my strong sense of duty. They squeezed every last drop of liquid cash out of my bank accounts to pay off the gambling and tax debts of a 38-year-old man who could not even bother to look up from his phone while I was supposedly suffocating to death. And now that they knew my cash reserves were completely empty, they realized they needed a new funding source to maintain their lavish lifestyle and protect Preston from his next inevitable disaster. They needed my lucrative business. They needed the equity in my home. But they could not get any of that while I was still breathing and capable of checking my own bank statements. I closed the laptop slowly, the soft click echoing in the silent bedroom. The sheer audacity of their plan was actually impressive. They had orchestrated a flawless extortion campaign followed immediately by a slow, methodical assassination attempt. They thought they were playing a brilliant game of chess against a completely blind opponent. They thought I was just a naive, exhausted workaholic who would quietly fade away and leave them the keys to my kingdom. I reached over to the nightstand and picked up my cell phone. It was time to stop playing the victim and start building the gallows. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name of a private security contractor I had helped find a home for last year. I pressed call and listened to the phone ring, a cold, dangerous smile finally spreading across my face. The clock on my nightstand glowed with an eerie green light cutting through the pitch-black darkness of my master bedroom. It was exactly 1 in the morning. The sprawling suburban house was completely silent, except for the faint, low rumble of the central air conditioning unit kicking into high gear. I was staring wide awake at the textured ceiling, my mind and racing 1,000,000 miles a minute. Beatrice and Richard had absolutely refused to leave the premises. They had taken over the sprawling downstairs guest suite, claiming it was their parental duty to monitor my fragile condition around the clock. They played the role of exhausted, terrified caregivers flawlessly for the neighbors. But the moment the front door closed, they had poured themselves generous glasses of my expensive scotch and made themselves entirely at home. They thought I was heavily medicated and deeply asleep upstairs. They had absolutely no idea that I was clutching a prepaid cell phone under my heavy down comforter, waiting for the exact right moment to strike. Earlier that afternoon, while my mother was busy loudly reorganizing my kitchen pantry to assert her dominance, I had sent a secure, encrypted text message to a man named Elias. Elias was not a standard suburban alarm technician. He was a highly specialized private security contractor who primarily handled corporate espionage and elite asset protection. I had helped him secure a massive multi-million-dollar commercial property 3 years ago, and I knew he possessed the exact kind of rare technical skills I desperately needed. I did not give him any unnecessary details over the text. I simply stated that I needed a complete covert indoor surveillance package deployed tonight, and that the targets were currently sleeping on the main floor of the residence. His reply was swift and professional. He told me to unlock the heavy side door leading through the garage at exactly 2 in the morning, and to keep all the main interior lights completely switched off. Getting him inside was going to be the most terrifying gamble of my entire life. If my father woke up and caught a strange man dressed in black drilling into the walls, my entire strategy would instantly collapse. They would immediately call the police, play the innocent, terrified victims, and use my supposed mental instability to have me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility before the sun even came up. I slipped out from under the warm covers, wearing thick wool socks to muffle my footsteps against the polished hardwood floors. I crept slowly down the long, curved staircase, testing every single wooden step for creaks before shifting my body weight. The darkness was thick and suffocating. The only illumination came from the pale silver moonlight spilling through the tall glass patio doors in the formal dining room. I reached the heavy side door in the laundry room and slowly turned the brass deadbolt. It unlocked with a soft metallic click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable shout from the guest suite, but nothing happened. A cool night breeze swept into the room, followed immediately by Elias. He moved like a ghost. He was a tall, imposing figure, dressed entirely in matte black, carrying a heavy reinforced tactical case that made absolutely zero noise when he set it down on the granite counter. He did not say a single word. He just looked at me, his sharp eyes taking in my pale face and trembling hands. I pointed a shaking finger down the long, dark hallway toward the closed door of the guest suite, signaling that my parents were asleep just 50 feet away. Elias gave a slow, deliberate nod, acknowledging the extreme danger of the situation. Watching him work was truly like watching a master surgeon perform an impossibly delicate operation. He opened his case, revealing rows of tiny, highly sophisticated lenses and complex, microscopic wiring systems. These were not the bulky plastic security cameras you buy at a hardware store. These were military-grade devices designed to be entirely invisible to the naked eye. He started in the kitchen. He expertly removed the digital display panel of my built-in stainless steel microwave and seamlessly embedded a pinhole camera directly behind the tinted glass. He angled the tiny lens perfectly to capture the entire kitchen island and the specific area where my mother always prepared my daily meals and poured my drinks. Every single movement he made was incredibly precise and completely silent. Next, we moved into the main living room. Elias unscrewed the ornate bronze faceplate of the central thermostat mounted on the hallway wall. He nestled a wide-angle lens deep inside the plastic housing, connecting the microscopic wires directly to the existing electrical current, so the camera would never, ever run out of battery power. This specific angle gave me a crystal-clear, high-definition view of the custom leather sofas where my family liked to sit and openly discuss my impending demise. The tension in the dark room was almost unbearable. At one terrifying point, the heavy wooden floorboards right outside the guest bedroom groaned loudly under the shifting weight of the house. My heart slammed violently into my throat. I pressed my back flat against the cold hallway wall, squeezing my eyes shut and praying my father was just rolling over in his sleep. We stood frozen in agonizing silence for 3 extremely long minutes before the rhythmic sound of deep snoring finally resumed. The final and absolutely most crucial installation took place right inside my own master bedroom. I needed irrefutable video evidence of exactly what they were doing to me while I was allegedly incapacitated in my own bed. Elias quietly placed a small stepping stool on the plush carpet and reached up to the standard smoke detector mounted directly above my pillows. He popped the plastic cover off and hid a high-resolution night vision camera right inside the small vent holes. He linked every single hidden device to a highly encrypted remote cloud server, entirely bypassing my standard home internet router, so the massive incoming data usage would never trigger an alert or show up on my monthly broadband bill. Before he left, he handed me a completely blank burner phone. He leaned in close and whispered that the live video feeds would automatically trigger the exact second any physical motion was detected in the designated zones. He packed up his empty tactical case and slipped back out the side door, vanishing into the cool, suburban night, leaving absolutely no physical trace of his presence behind. I locked the heavy deadbolt and slowly climbed back up the dark stairs. I slid under my heavy duvet, clutching the small black digital device tightly against my chest. The fear that had been paralyzing me for weeks was entirely gone. It was replaced by a cold, calculating anticipation. The trap was officially set and fully armed. My parents were going to wake up tomorrow morning thinking they still owned the world. They had no idea they were walking straight into a digital cage, and I was the one holding the remote control. The heavy sunlight pouring through the gaps in my bedroom curtains signaled the beginning of the most agonizing performance of my life. It was barely 8 in the morning when I heard the unmistakable heavy thud of the front door closing. My mother had arrived right on schedule to resume her twisted role as the devoted caregiver. I lay perfectly still under my heavy down comforter, forcing my breathing into a slow, rhythmic pattern. Every single muscle in my body was completely coiled with tension. My right hand was buried deep beneath the soft sheets, gripping the small black burner phone Elias had given me just hours before. I could hear the sharp clicking of my mother's expensive heels, echoing off the hardwood floor in the downstairs hallway. She was humming a cheerful little church hymn as she made her way into the kitchen. The sheer casualness of that melody sent a wave of absolute revulsion crashing through my stomach. She was literally singing a song praising the heavens while actively preparing to poison her own flesh and blood. A few moments later, the wooden stairs began to creak under her weight. I immediately closed my eyes, leaving only the tiniest sliver of vision open. The heavy bedroom door swung wide open, and Beatrice glided into the room. She carried a silver tray holding a steaming mug of herbal tea and fresh yellow tulips cut from my own garden. She set the tray down on the wooden nightstand, wiping her perfectly dry forehead with the back of her hand. She leaned over the bed and placed her cold hand gently against my cheek. I forced myself to lean into her touch, letting out a weak, pathetic groan. I whispered a raspy thank you for taking such good care of me. Beatrice smiled a wide, beaming grin that did not reach her cold, empty eyes. She claimed a mother's love was the greatest medicine in the world. She picked up my asthma inhaler, stating she needed to clean the dusty mouthpiece. She told me to rest while she went downstairs to prepare a week's worth of healthy meal prep containers. The second her footsteps faded down the staircase, I ripped the blankets off my face and stared at the glowing screen of the hidden device. My heart was pounding so violently against my ribs, I thought it might actually crack my chest open. I opened the secure application Elias had installed and waited for the encrypted connection to establish. The screen remained entirely black for 3 agonizing seconds before suddenly bursting into a crystal-clear, high-definition live feed of my own kitchen. The hidden camera embedded perfectly inside the microwave provided an incredibly sweeping view of the massive granite island. I watched the glowing digital display intently as my mother stepped fully into the frame. The transformation was absolutely terrifying to witness. The moment Beatrice thought she was entirely, completely alone, the warm maternal facade instantly vanished. Her shoulders dropped, and her face hardened into a mask of pure, cold calculation. She did not look like a grieving mother. She looked like an assassin preparing for a routine job. She walked over to her expensive leather purse resting on the bar stool and unzipped the hidden side pocket. My breath caught in my throat as she pulled out a small, thick glass vial filled with a perfectly clear liquid and a sterilized medical syringe. She set them down on the granite countertop right next to a row of 5 plastic meal prep containers filled with roasted vegetables and chicken she had just finished portioning out. I watched in horrified silence as she efficiently removed the plastic cap from the sharp needle. Her hands were completely steady. There was not a single ounce of hesitation or remorse in her fluid movements. She plunged the long metal needle deep into the rubber stopper of the glass vial and pulled back the plunger slowly, drawing up a precise measurement of the deadly industrial solvent. She injected the clear chemical directly into the center of the roasted chicken, perfectly mixing the poison into the rich sauce so it would be completely undetectable. She repeated this exact methodical process 4 more times, refilling the syringe and systematically contaminating every single meal I was supposed to eat for the rest of the week. But the absolute worst moment was what she did next. Beatrice picked up my red plastic asthma inhaler meant to save my life. She popped the medicine canister out of the plastic casing. She drew one final massive dose of the clear liquid from the glass vial. With terrifying precision, she coated the entire inside of the plastic mouthpiece with the heavy toxic solvent. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew the next time my chest tightened, I would pull those toxic chemicals directly into the deepest vulnerable parts of my struggling lungs. She was intentionally guaranteeing my death under the brilliant guise of medical emergency. She carefully wiped the outside of the inhaler with a clean paper towel to remove any stray residue and snapped the medicine canister back into place. I lay there on my bed, staring at the small digital screen as she casually washed the empty syringe in my stainless steel sink and slipped the glass vial back into her designer purse. I did not shed a single tear. My eyes were entirely bone dry. The deep, hollow ache of a daughter desperate for her mother's love was completely, utterly gone. It was violently burned away by the raw, toxic reality of what I had just witnessed. Any lingering trace of doubt or hesitation I had been desperately clinging to evaporated into the cold air of my silent bedroom. I pressed the record button securely, saving the high-definition video files directly to the encrypted cloud server Elias had built. I had the ghost perfectly trapped in the machine. Beatrice had just handed me the very weapon I needed to permanently destroy her. I slipped the black phone back under my heavy pillows and closed my eyes, waiting for her to bring me my poisoned breakfast, ready to play the greatest final act of my entire life. The aggressive sound of heavy footsteps stomping up my carpeted stairs shattered the quiet afternoon peace of my bedroom. It was not the light rhythmic tapping of my mother. These were the heavy, deliberate footfalls of grown men marching with absolute purpose. The brass doorknob turned sharply, and the heavy wooden door swung inward, hitting the wall with a loud thud. My father Richard walked in first, dressed in a stiff, tailored suit, looking like a corporate executive preparing to fire a low-level employee. Right behind him was my brother Preston, casually checking his expensive gold watch, with an arrogant smirk, completely ignoring the fact that he was invading a sick woman's private sanctuary. But it was the third man stepping into my bedroom that made my stomach violently churn. He was a short, balding man with slicked-back hair that looked permanently damp. He wore a cheap, shiny gray suit that reeked of stale cigarette smoke and discount cologne. He carried a battered leather briefcase, clutching it tightly against his chest like a shield. I recognized him instantly from his tacky late-night television commercials. His name was Gregory Thorne, and he was notorious in our city for handling the absolute sleaziest corporate loopholes and aggressive hostile takeovers. Seeing a bottom-feeding defense attorney standing at the foot of my bed sent a freezing electric shock straight through my nervous system. They were not just here to check my temperature. They were here to execute the legal phase of their murderous campaign. I quickly pulled the thick down comforter up to my chin, sinking deeper into the soft mattress. I forced my hands to shake and let my eyelids droop perfectly, adopting the role of the heavily medicated, fading daughter. Richard dragged a heavy wooden chair over from my vanity table and sat down right next to my pillow. He leaned in close, invading my personal space, and let out a long, theatrical sigh of profound sorrow. He reached out and patted my shoulder with a heavy, patronizing hand. He told me in a low, soothing voice that the entire family was incredibly worried about my rapid physical and mental decline. He boldly claimed that ever since my sudden collapse at the family dinner, they had been consulting with several top-tier medical professionals who all unanimously agreed my high-stress lifestyle was actively destroying my cognitive function. Preston walked around to the other side of the big bed, standing directly over me, blocking out the sunlight from the window. He crossed his arms over his chest and stared down at me with absolute contempt. He adopted a fake, gentle tone that was dripping with obvious venom. He told me I had to face the harsh reality of my current pathetic situation. He reminded me of the terrifying breathing crisis I suffered on their dining room floor, casually brushing off the event as a massive, psychological breakdown. He leaned down and whispered that I was clearly losing my grip on reality, claiming several of my top real estate clients had secretly called him to complain about my erratic behavior. It was a blatant, calculated lie designed exclusively to shatter my self-confidence. The sheer psychological violence of their gaslighting was absolutely breathtaking to witness. They were standing in my own house, boldly using the very physical symptoms they had intentionally caused by feeding me industrial poison to prove I was going crazy. They knew exactly why my chest was tight. They knew exactly why I was exhausted and confused. Beatrice had been meticulously drugging my meals for weeks specifically to create this exact scenario. And now Richard and Preston were swooping in to weaponize those very symptoms against me. They were painting a picture of a tragic, lonely spinster who was completely cracking under the pressure of her demanding career. Gregory Thorne finally stepped forward, placing his scuffed leather briefcase flat on the edge of my bed. He popped the brass latches open with a loud metallic click. He introduced himself with a greasy, unnatural smile, stating he was hired by my loving parents to help protect my best interests during this difficult transition. He spoke to me slowly and loudly as if I were a confused toddler. He said it was incredibly common for successful women to suffer extreme mental burnout, and there was absolutely no shame in stepping aside to let competent family members take the wheel. The sheer condescension in his raspy voice made my blood boil hot under my skin. I kept my face completely blank, allowing a single pathetic tear to roll slowly down my cheek. I let my breathing grow shallow and erratic perfectly, mimicking a woman hovering right on the edge of a severe panic attack. I asked my father, in a trembling, weak whisper, what exactly they wanted from me. Richard exchanged a quick, triumphant look with Preston over my head. It was a fleeting glance of pure, greedy excitement, but I caught every single millisecond of it. They genuinely thought their psychological torture was working perfectly. Richard softly stroked my hair, a gesture so incredibly fake, it made my skin crawl with physical revulsion. He told me I needed to stop worrying about my bank accounts, my properties, and my complicated real estate brokerage. He said I simply did not have the mental capacity to handle heavy financial decisions anymore. He smoothly explained that, as my loving, devoted father, it was his absolute duty to step in and relieve me of these massive burdens so I could focus entirely on recovering my fragile health. He promised they would handle absolutely everything for me, but they just needed to establish some formal legal boundaries. I lay there staring at the three men surrounding my bed, realizing the true depth of their absolute depravity. The poison was just the physical weapon to weaken my body. This sophisticated psychological ambush was the real weapon meant to destroy my entire life before my heart even stopped beating. I whimpered softly, pulling the blankets tighter around my shoulders, acting completely overwhelmed and entirely defeated. I was giving them exactly what they wanted, letting them feel the intoxicating rush of total power, because I knew that pride always comes right before the absolute hardest fall. Gregory Thorne reached his greasy hands deep into his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of pristine white legal documents. He did not hand them to me right away. Instead, he tapped the heavy stack against his knee perfectly, aligning the edges before gently placing them directly onto my lap. The stark contrast of the bright white paper resting on my dark blue duvet felt like a physical weight pressing down on my fragile chest. He cleared his throat, adjusting his cheap necktie, and explained that these were standard precautionary forms. He used soft, comforting words, calling them a simple medical proxy and a basic power of attorney. He claimed that, given the mysterious and rapid deterioration of my respiratory system, it was absolutely critical to have a legally designated decision-maker in place. He leaned closer, smelling of old coffee and peppermints, and painted a terrifying hypothetical picture. He asked me to imagine a scenario where my lungs completely gave out in the middle of the night, leaving me suddenly hooked up to a mechanical ventilator, unable to speak for myself. He said my family simply wanted to ensure my medical care would be handled seamlessly, without any unnecessary bureaucratic delays holding up my life-saving treatments. I let my trembling fingers brush against the top page of the legal packet. To an exhausted, terrified woman, it might have looked like a standard hospital admission form, but I was a highly experienced real estate broker who had spent 15 years reading incredibly complex binding contracts. I knew exactly where the legal traps were hidden. I slowly flipped past the standard medical directive pages and focused my blurry eyes entirely on the financial sections buried deep in the middle of the packet. The document was not a limited medical proxy. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. And the name listed as my sole authorized agent was not my father or my mother. It was my brother Preston. The man who had just bankrupted himself betting on bad tech startups and high-stakes casino tables was suddenly being handed the absolute legal right to manage my entire life. I forced my eyes to scan the specific clauses they thought I was too medicated to understand. If I put my signature on that final page, I was legally surrendering total control of my entire existence. Preston would gain immediate, unhindered access to all my personal and business bank accounts. He would have the legal authority to sign real estate deeds on my behalf, meaning he could instantly liquidate my newly purchased house and sell off my highly profitable brokerage firm. He could empty my retirement funds, take out massive loans in my name, and drain the operating accounts of my business, all while I was lying heavily sedated in a hospital bed. They were not trying to protect my health. They were legally structuring a hostile corporate takeover of my life, using a lethal chemical poison to force the merger. I looked up from the papers, letting a look of genuine confusion and rising panic wash over my face. I looked directly at my father and asked in a weak, cracking voice why Preston needed unlimited access to my business checking accounts, if this was just about a potential medical emergency. I asked why my real estate brokerage was specifically named in the transfer of authority clauses. The fake, warm atmosphere in the bedroom instantly evaporated. The greasy lawyer looked nervously at my father. Richard took a step closer to the bed, completely abandoning his gentle patriarchal facade. His face darkened, and his jaw muscles visibly clenched. He pointed a rigid finger at me, and dropped the terrifying ultimatum they had brought into my home. Richard told me my mind was clearly failing because I was asking paranoid, delusional questions. He coldly stated that my intense, irrational suspicion of my own loving family was absolute proof that the mysterious illness was aggressively attacking my brain. He crossed his arms and delivered the final, crushing threat without a single ounce of hesitation. He told me I had exactly 2 choices right now. I could willingly sign the documents like a good, grateful daughter and let Preston handle my complicated affairs while I rested quietly in my bed. Or, if I stubbornly refused to cooperate, he would immediately march down to the county courthouse tomorrow morning. He threatened to file an emergency petition for a hostile, involuntary conservatorship. He boldly declared that he and Gregory Thorne had already gathered enough medical evidence, including testimony from my recent hospital visit, to legally prove I was entirely incompetent to manage my own life. The sheer, suffocating weight of the word conservatorship hung heavily in the quiet air of my bedroom. It was the ultimate legal nuclear weapon. They were explicitly threatening to drag my name through the local court system, strip me of my basic human rights, and have a judge permanently declare me legally insane. Once that happened, I would be entirely locked in a legal cage. I would not be able to hire my own lawyer, access my own money, or even leave my own house without their strict written permission. And they would have absolutely unlimited time to finish slowly poisoning me because no one would ever believe the wild murder accusations of a legally documented paranoid woman. Preston leaned against the wall, checking his phone again, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh of annoyance. He casually mentioned that court battles were incredibly stressful and expensive. He told me it would be incredibly embarrassing for a prominent local real estate broker to have her massive mental breakdown completely exposed in the public county records for all her wealthy clients to read. He smiled a sick, twisted smile, entirely confident that he had perfectly cornered me. They had intentionally engineered an impossible, terrifying situation. They were holding a loaded legal gun directly to my head using my own manufactured physical weakness as the bullets. I stared down at the crisp white papers resting on my legs, the silence in the room stretching out into an agonizing heavy pause. The brilliant, horrifying perfection of their trap became utterly clear. If I fought back right now, I would lose everything through a rigged legal system, while my body slowly felled from the toxic chemicals hidden in my kitchen. The only possible way out of this deadly maze was to willingly walk straight into the center of it. I had to let them think they had won the absolute ultimate victory, so they would grow reckless and arrogant. I had to hand them the rope they desperately wanted so I could quietly tie it directly around their own necks. I reached out with a trembling, sweating hand and asked the greasy lawyer if I could borrow his pen. But my voice was intentionally barely a whisper. Gregory Thorne eagerly reached into his breast pocket and produced a cheap black ballpoint. He held it out to me like it was a winning lottery ticket. I slowly shook my head, letting a fresh wave of manufactured tears well up in my eyes. I pointed a trembling finger toward the solid oak nightstand beside my bed. I told him in a fragile, cracked voice that I always signed important legal documents with my own lucky fountain pen. The heavy blue ink, one sitting right next to the brass lamp. It was a completely mundane request from a supposedly confused woman, but it was actually the most critical tactical maneuver of my entire life. My father rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by the slight delay, but he quickly grabbed the blue pen and practically shoved it into my shaking hand. The thick tension in the bedroom was suddenly replaced by a palpable, electric sense of raw greed. I could practically hear my brother Preston salivating as he stared at the crisp white pages resting on my legs. They were like starving wolves circling a wounded animal, entirely blinded by the scent of fresh blood and incoming cash. I took a deep, shuddering breath, playing the role of the utterly defeated daughter to absolute perfection. I let the tears spill over my eyelashes, leaving wet, salty tracks down my pale cheeks. I looked directly into my father's cold eyes, my lower lip quivering uncontrollably. I begged him to promise me that he would protect my hard-earned money and ensure my loyal real estate clients were not completely abandoned during my mysterious illness. I pleaded with him, my voice breaking on every single syllable, asking if he truly believed this was the absolute only way I could get better. Richard did not miss a single beat. He leaned in, placing a heavy, warm hand over my trembling fingers, and delivered a performance worthy of a Silver Screen Award. He swore on his own life that they were doing this purely out of deep parental love. He promised that Preston would manage everything with the utmost care and integrity until I was fully healed and back on my feet. The sheer audacity of his calculated lies, spoken with such earnest conviction, while a lethal industrial poison sat hidden in my kitchen downstairs, was completely breathtaking. I squeezed his hand back, sobbing softly, feeding his massive inflated ego the exact validation he desperately craved. I shifted my gaze to the thick stack of legal documents, the comprehensive durable power of attorney that would effectively sign away my entire empire. I slowly uncapped the heavy fountain pen, my hand violently shaking on purpose to make the pathetic charade completely believable. I hovered the metal nib over the final signature line on the last page. In that split second, I felt the intense burning gaze of the three men standing around my bed. They were entirely focused on the blue ink, mentally spending my life savings and plotting the swift, lucrative sale of my house. I pressed the pen to the paper and began to write. I did not use my standard, confident, flowing, professional signature. Instead, I carefully executed a slightly altered, jagged, and uniquely slanted version of my name using that specific brilliant blue ink. I deliberately skipped my middle initial and looped the final letter backward, dragging the nib slightly to create a messy finish. To the untrained, greedy eyes of my family and their bottom-feeding lawyer, it just looked like the frantic handwriting of a heavily medicated, exhausted woman. But to the elite high-power trust and estate attorney I had secretly retained weeks ago, it was the exact registered visual code for a signature given under severe illegal duress. The absolute second the wet ink dried on the final white page, the entire atmosphere in the room violently snapped. The fake, warm, protective familial bubble instantly burst into a million pieces. Preston literally lunged forward and snatched the thick packet of papers right off my lap. He did not even bother to say thank you or offer a single word of basic comfort. He immediately began flipping through the pages, his greedy eyes scanning the fresh blue ink to ensure every single necessary line was perfectly filled out and legally binding. A massive, arrogant smirk spread completely across his face. It was the sickening smile of a man who firmly believed he had just inherited the entire world without doing a single day of honest hard work. He tapped the documents against the side of his leg and looked over at my father, giving a sharp, triumphant nod. Richard stood up completely straight, the fake posture of a worried father entirely vanishing into thin air. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket and smoothed his silk tie, looking down at me as if I were a piece of broken, useless furniture he was about to throw out to the curb. Gregory Thorne grabbed the legal documents from Preston and shoved them haphazardly into his battered leather briefcase, snapping the heavy brass latches shut with a loud final click. The sleazy lawyer wiped his sweaty forehead and muttered a quick professional goodbye, already mentally calculating his massive legal fee for orchestrating this hostile takeover. My father and brother did not linger for another single second. They had exactly what they came for. The golden goose had officially been slaughtered, and they were incredibly eager to get out of the room to celebrate their massive financial victory. Richard gave my shoulder one last careless, heavy pat and told me to get some rest entirely, dropping his soft, soothing tone. His voice was now completely cold and completely dismissive. Preston walked toward the bedroom door, practically skipping with joyful, aggressive energy. Right before he walked out into the hallway, he turned his head and shot me one final look of absolute, terrifying contempt. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet shadows. I sank back against my plush pillows, the fake tears instantly drying on my cold face. I could hear their muffled laughter echoing down the wooden staircase. They genuinely thought they had just locked me in a permanent financial cage. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the ironclad master key to their total, absolute destruction. The heavy silence that settled over my master bedroom after my family left was not the silence of defeat. It was the calm, absolute stillness of a predator waiting in the tall grass. I threw off the heavy duvet and stepped onto the hardwood floor, my legs completely steady. The pathetic, trembling woman who had just signed away her life was a complete and utter illusion. I walked over to the window and peeked through the expensive plantation shutters, watching my father's luxury sedan back out of my driveway. Preston was sitting in the passenger seat, laughing so hard his shoulders were visibly shaking. They were celebrating a massive victory they had absolutely not earned. They thought they had entirely outsmarted me, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the kind of woman they raised. Let me tell you exactly what that specific blue ink and that messy signature actually meant. 3 days ago, right after I discovered the $27,000 bank fraud and realized my own mother was actively poisoning me, I made a very important phone call. I did not call the local police. I called a woman named Veronica Sterling. Veronica is one of the most ruthless, highly respected trust and estate litigators in the entire state. She charges $1,000 an hour, and she is worth absolutely every single penny. When I sat in her opulent downtown office and laid out the entire horrific conspiracy, she did not just offer me basic legal advice. She helped me engineer a flawless federal trap. Veronica explained that if I simply refused to sign their fake power of attorney, my family would immediately drag me into probate court. They would tie up my assets in a lengthy, miserable legal battle, while continuing to live in my house and slowly drug my meals. We needed them to willingly act on the fraudulent document. We needed them to commit massive, undeniable financial crimes using a forged authorization. So Veronica legally registered a specific visual distress signal for me. The jagged, backward-looped signature executed exclusively in that bright blue ink was officially notarized and filed in her private steel vault. 48 hours before my family even walked into my bedroom. It legally voided every single document I signed that afternoon, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was acting under extreme hostile duress and a direct threat to my life. But voiding the document was only the very first step. We needed to guarantee that when the hammer finally fell, it would crush them completely. They were not just going to face local misdemeanor charges. We were going federal. I walked over to my bedroom closet and pulled out a sleek, black digital hard drive. Over the past 72 hours, I had meticulously compiled the most devastating arsenal of evidence ever assembled against a single family. I had crystal-clear, high-definition video files downloaded directly from the hidden cameras Elias had installed. The footage showed my mother Beatrice systematically injecting industrial toxic solvent into my daily meals and coating my life-saving asthma inhaler with poison. Her face was completely visible, her actions deliberate and entirely unhurried. Right next to those horrific video files were the comprehensive medical reports provided by Dr. Harrison. He had fully documented the lethal levels of the industrial chemical building up inside my bloodstream, matching the exact poison shown in the hidden camera footage. And finally, the absolute crown jewel of the digital dossier was the complete forensic financial trail. I had the official bank routing numbers proving my $27,000 house down payment was fraudulently transferred to pay off Preston's massive underground gambling debts and his federal tax liens. They had committed severe wire fraud across state lines to cover up massive tax evasion. I sat at my mahogany desk and initiated a secure encrypted video call. Veronica appeared on the screen looking incredibly sharp in a tailored white suit. Sitting right next to her was a man with a severe military haircut and piercing dark eyes. He introduced himself as Special Agent Hayes with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was a prominent contact Veronica had called in specifically for this complex case. I did not waste a single second. I hit a button on my keyboard securely transmitting the entire digital dossier directly to the federal server. I watched the agent's face as he reviewed the evidence in real time. For a man who had likely seen the absolute worst of human nature, his jaw visibly tightened as he watched the high-definition footage of a mother poisoning her own daughter's medical equipment. Agent Hayes looked directly into the camera and told me the situation had officially escalated far beyond a simple domestic dispute. He explained that because the fraudulent wire transfers crossed multiple state lines to pay off illicit debts, and because the industrial solvent was transported over the state border from Preston's failed warehouse space, we had absolute federal jurisdiction. My family was no longer just looking at a local assault charge. They were walking straight into a massive federal indictment for wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, extortion, and attempted first-degree murder. He asked me if I was absolutely certain I wanted to proceed because once the massive federal machine started turning, there was absolutely no way to stop it. I did not blink. I did not hesitate. I looked at the dark screen of my laptop and thought about the agonizing pain in my chest when I collapsed on their dining room floor. I thought about Preston stepping directly over my suffocating body to grab another slice of roast beef. I told Agent Hayes to let the machine run them over completely. He nodded, stating they needed a few more days to quietly build the airtight indictments and secure the federal arrest warrants without tipping off their greedy, sleazy lawyer. He instructed me to play my role perfectly just a little while longer. He warned me that the most dangerous time in any undercover sting operation is the brief period right after the bait is fully taken. My family would be riding a massive high of arrogant confidence, feeling completely untouchable. They would likely start making bold, reckless moves using the fake power of attorney, and I had to let them do it. Every single time Preston used that forged document to access my accounts or attempt a real estate transaction, he would be actively committing another massive federal felony, adding decades to his inevitable prison sentence. I had to sit in the dark and watch them loot my kingdom, knowing the entire time that the gold they were stealing was completely cursed. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my heavy leather office chair, smiling softly in the quiet room. The heavy, suffocating fear that had been crushing my chest for weeks was entirely gone. It was replaced by a cold, calculating anticipation that felt incredibly empowering. The massive arsenal was fully loaded. The federal target was perfectly locked. My parents and my golden child brother thought they had successfully executed the perfect crime. They had absolutely no idea that I was the one directing the entire show from behind the heavy velvet curtain. All I had to do now was wait patiently in the shadows and let their own boundless greed drag them straight down to hell. The distinct sound of the heavy brass zipper being violently yanked open broke the quiet calm of my early evening. I was lying perfectly still on top of my luxurious duvet, staring blankly at the dark ceiling while the sun dipped below the horizon outside my bedroom window. The forged power of attorney was barely 24 hours old, and my family was already treating my primary residence like a massive estate sale where absolutely everything was completely free for the taking. I reached under my heavy pillow and pulled out the secure black burner phone Elias had given me. I did not open the hidden camera video application this time. I opened the encrypted high-definition audio recorder, pressing the bright red circle, and placed the device flat on my wooden nightstand to capture every single sickening word echoing up the long curved staircase. My heavy bedroom door was cracked open just a couple of inches, allowing the pristine acoustics of my spacious two-story house to carry their loud voices directly to my ears. Beatrice and Preston were not sneaking around in the dark like standard suburban burglars terrified of getting caught in the act. They were moving aggressively through my main floor with the casual, arrogant entitlement of lottery winners eagerly cashing in their golden ticket. I could hear the unmistakable loud clinking of my heavy antique silverware being unceremoniously dumped from its custom velvet-lined mahogany box directly into a thick plastic trash bag. That specific silver set was an incredibly rare 19th century collection I had proudly purchased at a high-end estate auction in London to celebrate my very first $1 million commercial real estate closing. It was a physical, heavy representation of my relentless hard work, and my own mother was currently tossing it around like cheap plastic utensils from a fast food drive-thru. Preston let out a sharp, loud whistle of pure, greedy appreciation. I heard the heavy, custom wooden doors of my downstairs walk-in coat closet swing wide open, hitting the wall. He shouted across the house to Beatrice, announcing that he had just located my hidden collection of authentic designer handbags. He started reading the luxury brand names out loud, laughing hysterically as he quickly calculated the immediate resale value on the secondary fashion market. He bragged that the pristine calfskin leather tote bag alone would easily cover at least 3 months of massive interest payments on his dangerous underground gambling debts. Beatrice chuckled warmly in response. It was that exact same soft, affectionate maternal laugh she used to give me when I was a little girl, bringing home a perfect straight-A report card. But she was not praising my hard work anymore. She was openly praising her golden child for successfully looting my personal closet, while I was supposedly lying incapacitated just 1 floor above them. I lay completely frozen in the dark, listening closely as their heavy footsteps moved from the front hallway directly into my formal dining room. Beatrice casually mentioned that she had always deeply admired the stunning vintage diamond and sapphire tennis bracelet I kept securely locked inside the antique glass display cabinet near the window. I braced myself, waiting for the sound of her searching for the hidden key. Instead, I heard the sharp, violent crash of breaking glass. She did not even bother trying to find the small brass key I kept carefully hidden in the home office desk. She simply took a heavy object and smashed the delicate antique glass door to grab the expensive jewelry. Preston stopped laughing for a brief second and asked her if she thought I would notice the missing family diamonds or the shattered glass covering the floor when I eventually woke up from my heavy medication nap. The immediate answer my mother gave him sent a massive wave of absolute freezing ice directly through my veins. She scoffed loudly, her voice echoing up the tall staircase, telling him not to worry. His handsome head about my fading memory. She stated in a cold, entirely detached voice that her poor, sick daughter would absolutely not be leaving that bed anytime soon, and she certainly will not need designer bags or expensive diamonds where she is going. The sheer monstrous nature of that single chilling sentence practically suffocated me in the dark room. My own mother was actively planning my funeral wardrobe while simultaneously wearing my stolen jewelry and admiring herself in my hallway mirror. The extreme level of psychological restraint it took to stay perfectly flat on that mattress and not march straight down those wooden stairs to physically throw them out into the cold street was completely agonizing. My fingernails dug so deeply into the soft palms of my hands that I actually drew tiny, painful drops of warm blood. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs. I wanted to smash their smug, greedy faces into the expensive marble countertops they genuinely thought they now rightfully owned. But I forced myself to take slow, deep, silent breaths through my nose, I repeatedly reminded myself that every single piece of antique silver they stole, and every single diamond they aggressively shoved into their pockets, was just another heavy iron bar being permanently welded onto their future federal prison cells. They spent the next 2 agonizing hours systematically tearing through my beautiful, carefully curated home. They raided my locked filing cabinets looking for any loose emergency cash. They packed up my entire expensive vintage wine collection into heavy cardboard moving boxes, dragging them across the hardwood floors. They even had the absolute shameless audacity to loudly debate whether or not they should just go ahead and list my imported Italian leather living room furniture on a local online marketplace right then and there. They were deeply intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. The fake power of attorney had acted like a massive shot of pure adrenaline straight into their greedy black hearts. They felt completely invincible. They firmly believed the weak, pathetic woman shivering upstairs in the dark was entirely eliminated from the grand financial equation. When I finally heard the heavy wooden front door slam shut and the electronic deadbolt lock from the outside, the violated house fell back into a profound, deafening silence. I reached over to the nightstand and tapped the glowing screen of the black burner phone, stopping the encrypted audio recording. I had just successfully captured 2 solid hours of crystal-clear, high-definition audio, proving extreme, premeditated theft and highlighting their terrifying, undeniable, murderous intent. I securely uploaded the massive audio file directly to the remote federal server for Agent Hayes to add to his rapidly growing mountain of airtight criminal evidence. I slowly sat up in the dark, rubbing the necessary circulation back into my stiff, tired arms. They had successfully raided my home and stolen my favorite physical possessions, but they had carelessly left their absolute most valuable asset completely unguarded. Their massive arrogance had made them incredibly sloppy, and that fatal flaw was exactly what I needed to trigger the next devastating phase of my trap. The digital dashboard on my laptop illuminated the dark corners of my bedroom with a harsh artificial light. It was Tuesday morning, and the financial alerts I had specifically set up with my attorney were flashing a brilliant warning red. Preston was apparently not satisfied with merely stealing my vintage silver and diamond jewelry. His massive underground gambling debts were clearly breathing down his neck, because his next move was entirely desperate and unimaginably reckless. He did not even wait for the toxic chemicals my mother was feeding me to finally stop my heart. He wanted the absolute biggest asset I owned, and he needed the cash immediately. My secure burner phone vibrated silently against the soft mattress. It was an encrypted message from Veronica. She instructed me to log into the secure viewing portal she had established with the federal investigators. When I opened the link, my stomach performed a violent, nauseating flip. Preston had officially initiated a massive off-market real estate transaction. He was actively using the forged power of attorney to completely liquidate my primary residence while I was lying in the master bedroom right above him. He had bypassed the traditional real estate market, entirely avoiding standard home inspections and local agents who might ask difficult questions about my sudden medical decline. Instead, he had contacted a predatory out-of-state cash-buying firm. These were the kind of shadowy investment groups that purchased distressed properties for pennies on the dollar with zero contingencies. They had offered him barely 40% of what my beautiful custom home was actually worth. But my golden child brother did not care about my hard-earned equity or my financial legacy. He just saw a massive pile of immediate cash that could save his own kneecaps from his aggressive casino creditors. To finalize the fraudulent sale quickly, Preston made the most spectacularly arrogant mistake of his entire miserable life. The cash-buying firm was headquartered just across the state line. Rather than waiting for a local notary and risking my established banking connections flagging the massive irregular transaction, Preston decided to drive the forged documents there himself. My brother physically crossed state borders with fraudulent legal papers to execute a multi-million-dollar real estate scam. By crossing that invisible geographic line, he unknowingly upgraded his crime from a local state-level felony to a massive federal offense. I sat perfectly still on my bed, watching the digital escrow tracker update in real time. A profound wave of raw panic briefly washed over my entire body. I typed a frantic message to Veronica, asking if we should freeze the accounts right now before he actually signed away my house. I was terrified of permanently losing the secure sanctuary I had spent 15 years building. But Veronica called me back immediately. Her voice coming through the small phone speaker was incredibly calm and frighteningly cold. She told me to take a deep breath and trust the federal trap we had meticulously built together. She explained the complex legal strategy with absolute precision. If we stopped Preston right now, while he was just sitting in a conference room holding a pen, a clever defense attorney could argue it was all a terrible, tragic misunderstanding. They could easily claim Preston got confused about the true extent of his legal authority under the power of attorney. But if we let him sign the documents and allowed the fraudulent wire transfer to officially enter the federal banking system, the crime became absolute and irreversible. We had to let him steal the house to guarantee he would never see the outside of a federal prison cell ever again. I stared at the glowing screen, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Agent Hayes had somehow tapped directly into the title company database. I watched the digital progress bar slowly fill from left to right. I pictured my arrogant brother sitting in a plush leather chair in a neighboring state, confidently sliding that forged blue ink signature across a polished mahogany table. I imagined the smug, victorious smile on his face as he casually handed over the legal rights to a kingdom he did absolutely nothing to earn. The seconds dragged on like agonizing hours. My breath completely caught in my throat as the status on the digital portal suddenly shifted from pending to processing. The predatory cash buyers had fully accepted the forged power of attorney without a single question. They officially authorized the massive release of funds. The computer screen flashed a bright, undeniable green. The massive wire transfer of over $500,000 had officially left the out-of-state escrow account and successfully landed directly into Preston's personal banking account. He actually did it. He sold my home out from under me. A strange, dizzying sensation washed over my tired body. But then Veronica spoke through the secure phone connection. Her voice was laced with pure, predatory triumph. She announced that the wire had officially crossed state lines, and the federal trap was completely sprung. Preston had just committed 2 counts of massive federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Agent Hayes chimed in, confirming that the Federal Bureau of Investigation now had every single piece of irrefutable evidence they needed. Because the entire real estate transaction was executed using a signature legally registered as under extreme duress, the sale of my house was entirely void the very second it was processed. The sleazy cash buyers would lose their massive investment, and Preston would bear the absolute full weight of the federal government crashing down on his arrogant head. I did not actually lose my home. I simply used it as the ultimate irresistible bait to destroy him. I disconnected the secure call and closed the laptop, letting the quiet afternoon shadows reclaim my bedroom. Downstairs, I could hear the faint sound of my front door unlocking. Preston was finally returning home from his little interstate road trip. He walked into the grand foyer whistling a cheerful, upbeat tune, completely intoxicated by his massive, newly acquired wealth. He genuinely thought he was a brilliant mastermind who had just successfully solved all his horrific financial problems without facing a single consequence. He had absolutely no idea that the money sitting in his bank account was completely radioactive. He was walking around my house a completely free man today, but his permanent digital tombstone had already been fully carved. The scent of heavy, expensive floral perfume and aggressive chemical hairspray drifted up my long, curved staircase, completely replacing the familiar, comforting smell of my own home. It was Saturday afternoon, the day of the highly anticipated annual spring gala hosted by Grace Fellowship. This was not a humble, quiet neighborhood chapel where people went to seek quiet spiritual guidance. Grace Fellowship was a sprawling modern American megachurch complete with a commercial coffee shop, a massive high-definition broadcast studio, and a congregation heavily populated by the absolute wealthiest, influential families in our entire county. For my mother, Beatrice, this massive church was her ultimate favorite stage. It was a highly competitive arena where local social status was measured not just by massive financial tithes, but by visible, performative righteousness and public displays of extreme faith. And right now she was downstairs actively preparing to deliver the absolute greatest performance of her entire manipulative life. I lay perfectly still in my dark bedroom, staring blindly at the textured ceiling while listening to her pace back and forth across my polished hardwood floors. She was on a lengthy phone call with the head of the church women's ministry, and she was intentionally speaking loudly enough for her dramatic voice to echo throughout the empty halls. I reached under my heavy blanket, grabbed my secure black burner phone, and opened the live audio application, just to make absolutely sure the federal investigators were capturing every single sickening syllable. Beatrice was putting on an absolute masterclass in extreme emotional manipulation. I listened closely as her voice trembled and cracked with flawless theatrical timing. She told the wealthy ministry leader that she had barely slept a single wink in over 3 weeks because she was entirely consumed with providing round-the-clock care for my failing physical body. She painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture of a devoted mother helplessly watching her fiercely independent daughter slowly waste away from a mysterious, cruel respiratory illness. She actually had the shameless audacity to describe the terrifying breathing crisis I suffered on her dining room floor, framing the horrific event as a tragic, heavy cross she was bravely being forced to bear. She asked the entire massive congregation to pray for her emotional strength, because it was just so incredibly agonizing to watch her precious, successful girl suffer in the dark. The sheer, breathtaking level of hypocrisy was almost physically suffocating to endure. This was the exact same woman who had meticulously injected severe, industrial paint solvent into my daily meal prep containers just a few days prior. She was literally, actively paralyzing my lungs from the inside out, and then immediately turning around to harvest deep social sympathy and community admiration for my drastically declining oxygen levels. The women on the other end of the phone call were completely eating it up. I could clearly hear the tinny sound of their high-pitched voices coming through the phone speaker, praising Beatrice for her unshakable Christian faith and her boundless maternal sacrifice. They openly called her a living saint. They promised that the entire influential church community was rallying entirely behind her, my father, Richard, and my brother, Preston, during this unimaginable, terrifying family trial. Over the past 2 agonizing weeks, the lucrative fruits of her performative martyrdom had been rapidly piling up on my front porch. Through the hidden security cameras, I had watched a continuous steady stream of luxury sport utility vehicles pull into my long driveway, delivering massive floral arrangements, expensive catered meals from high-end local restaurants, and beautiful handwritten cards praising my parents for their holy, unwavering devotion. Beatrice would eagerly greet these wealthy, influential church members at my front door, deliberately wearing a slightly wrinkled, oversized cardigan to look appropriately exhausted, while gently dabbing at her completely dry eyes with a white tissue. She would graciously accept their expensive gifts, whispering soft, humble prayers of immense gratitude before shutting the heavy wooden door and immediately complaining to my father about the cheap quality of the baked pasta they had just dropped off. She was intentionally using my slow, agonizing murder as a convenient social ladder to climb straight to the absolute top of the local suburban elite. The spring gala was supposed to be her ultimate crowning achievement. It was a massive formal event held annually at the most exclusive private country club in the city, with over 500 wealthy guests attending in expensive evening gowns and tailored designer tuxedos. For years, Beatrice had desperately tried to secure a coveted seat at the main head table next to the senior pastor and the powerful local politicians. Now, thanks entirely to her tragic leading role as the grieving, exhausted caregiver of a dying real estate broker, she had finally been granted that highly exclusive spot. I heard the sharp click of the phone disconnecting downstairs, followed immediately by the familiar clinking sound of ice hitting a heavy crystal glass. My mother was pouring herself a very generous mid-afternoon drink from my stolen private liquor cabinet to quietly celebrate her successful emotional manipulation. A few minutes later, her heavy, deliberate footsteps began ascending the wooden stairs. I immediately closed my eyes, letting my jaw drop slightly open, and sinking my body deep into the soft mattress to play my necessary part. The heavy bedroom door opened with a slow, soft creak. Beatrice walked into the dark room, smelling strongly of expensive gin and sweet vanilla perfume. She did not bring me any fresh water or ask if I was experiencing any physical pain. She walked straight past my bed over to my full-length antique mirror and began holding up a stunning, dark, emerald silk evening gown against her body, turning side to side to check her reflection in the dim light. It was a brand new, expensive designer dress She had undoubtedly purchased using the money Preston had recently stolen from my business checking accounts with that forged power of attorney. She looked at my motionless, pale body in the mirror. Through the reflection, her eyes entirely, completely cold and completely devoid of any human empathy. She let out a soft, satisfied hum, adjusting the elegant neckline of the expensive green fabric. She leaned forward, examining her perfect makeup, and whispered softly to the empty room, stating that tonight was going to be absolutely flawless. She was completely intoxicated by the massive wave of public pity and social power she was currently riding. She firmly believed she was the brave, tragic heroine in a beautiful movie, and I was just a convenient, disposable prop slowly dying in the background to give her character more emotional depth and audience sympathy. I kept my breathing perfectly shallow, feeling a dark, heavy anger burning fiercely in the very center of my chest. She was going to walk confidently into that massive crystal ballroom tonight and play the weeping martyr in front of 500 powerful people. She was going to eagerly soak up their prayers, their tears, and their endless praise, completely unaware that every single step she took in those expensive shoes was leading her directly onto a public scaffold I had meticulously built with federal agents. Let her have her beautiful emerald dress and her exclusive seating arrangements. Let her absorb every single ounce of their misplaced admiration, because the higher she climbed up that fragile pedestal of holy lies, the more bones she was going to permanently shatter when I finally violently ripped it out from under her feet. The heavy silence of the house returned the moment my mother finally drove away to her salon appointment. I waited exactly 10 minutes before slipping out from under the covers and quietly walking downstairs to the kitchen. My body felt surprisingly light. The deep brain fog caused by the toxic solvent was finally beginning to lift because I had been secretly dumping the poisoned meals down the garbage disposal for 3 days. I walked over to the massive granite island to pour myself a glass of clean, filtered water. That is when I saw it. Resting right next to the designer fruit bowl was a stack of glossy, heavy cardstock papers. Beatrice had apparently brought home the official printed programs for the Grace Fellowship Spring Gala and carelessly left a few sitting out in the open. I picked up the thick, expensive paper and let my eyes scan the elegant gold foil lettering. The cover featured a beautiful professional photograph of the sprawling country club ballroom. I opened the program expecting to see the standard schedule of charity auctions and youth ministry choir performances. But right in the dead center of the booklet, printed on a dedicated full page, was a massive, high-definition photograph of my own face. It was a picture taken at last year's Christmas dinner when I was vibrant and completely healthy. Below my smiling face in bold, dramatic letters were the words, "Clara's Fight, a Community Call to Action." My hands started to tremble, but not from physical weakness. I read the detailed paragraphs below the photograph. The text was a beautifully written, entirely fabricated story about my tragic, sudden battle with a rare, aggressive respiratory failure. It described my parents as tireless warriors, sacrificing everything to keep me comfortable in my final days. It detailed my brother Preston's supposed heroic efforts to manage my crumbling real estate business while sitting bravely by my bedside. But the absolute most sickening part was at the very bottom of the page. There was a large black square, a digital scannable code instructing all the wealthy church members to donate generously to a newly established medical trust. The printed goal for the evening was $100,000. I took the glossy program upstairs to my master bedroom and immediately opened my laptop. I held my phone camera over the printed square and followed the digital link. It took me to a sleek, beautifully designed fundraising website, completely customized with my photographs and dramatic daily medical updates that my mother had completely invented. The page claimed the money was desperately needed to cover specialized out-of-state oxygen treatments and experimental lung therapies. I clicked on the Financial Transparency tab at the bottom of the page. I used my extensive professional real estate background to trace the routing numbers embedded in the donation portal. The medical trust did not belong to a specialized hospital. It did not belong to a legitimate healthcare foundation. The entire massive fundraising campaign was linked directly to a private offshore banking account, and the sole listed beneficiary The only person with the legal authority to withdraw every single donated dollar was Preston. A cold, hollow laugh escaped my lips, echoing in the quiet bedroom. The sheer magnitude of their evil was almost too immense to fully comprehend. They were not satisfied with simply stealing my life savings. They were not satisfied with tricking a cash buyer into purchasing my home. They wanted to squeeze every last drop of financial value out of my dying body before they finally threw me in the dirt. They were planning to stand up in front of the mayor, the local politicians, and 500 of the wealthiest families in the county to beg for cash, using my impending death as their ultimate emotional hook. They were actively monetizing my murder. I grabbed my secure burner phone and immediately dialed Agent Hayes. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him to log on to the federal server right now and sent him the direct link to the fraudulent charity portal. I heard the sharp sound of his keyboard clicking through the secure connection. For several long seconds, there was absolutely nothing but heavy silence on the line. When the veteran federal agent finally spoke, his voice was completely laced with pure professional shock. He stated that soliciting fraudulent donations over the internet using a false medical pretext crossed the line into massive federal charity fraud. Agent Hayes explained that because they were planning to publicly solicit these funds at a massive gathering using digital payment portals, they were actively planning to commit hundreds of individual counts of wire fraud in a single evening. He told me the federal prosecutor would not just be looking at a standard attempted murder charge anymore. This brazen public scam would trigger massive financial enhancements that would absolutely guarantee Preston and Beatrice would never breathe free air again. But Agent Hayes also gave me a very strict warning. He said the authorities needed the gala to actually happen. They needed my family to take that brightly lit stage and officially ask the crowd for the money. They needed the digital transactions to go completely live. I thanked him and ended the encrypted call. I looked back down at the glossy program resting on my bed. My mother wanted a dramatic, tragic performance tonight. She wanted to parade her dying daughter in front of the entire community to secure her final massive payday. I walked over to my closet and pulled out a simple, elegant black dress. If they wanted me to attend their beautiful, twisted party, I was absolutely going to be there. I was going to sit in my wheelchair looking pale and entirely defeated while they told their beautiful lies to the crowd. I would let them climb to the absolute highest peak of their arrogant glory. I would let them secure their fraudulent donations and smile for the flashing cameras. Because the public stage they had so carefully constructed was going to become the exact site of their absolute total destruction. 4 hours before the grand doors of the Grace Fellowship Ballroom were scheduled to open, the heavy atmosphere inside my house felt like a tightly coiled spring. I was sitting at my mahogany vanity staring at my reflection in the spotless glass. I had spent 30 minutes carefully applying pale foundation and dark eyeshadow underneath my lashes to completely hollow out my face. I needed to look like a woman hovering right on the edge of death. I was brushing translucent powder over my cheekbones when I heard the aggressive rumble of a sports car engine turning into my private driveway. It was Preston. I listened to his expensive dress shoes clicking loudly against the hardwood floor of the downstairs foyer. He was whistling a cheerful melody, completely oblivious to the fact that his criminal empire was about to violently collapse. I quickly walked back to my large bed, pulling the heavy duvet up to my waist, adopting my familiar pathetic posture. The bedroom door swung open without a single knock. Preston walked into the room looking absolutely immaculate. He was already wearing his tailored designer tuxedo, the dark fabric perfectly pressed, and a crisp silk bow tie resting at his throat. He looked like a wealthy entrepreneur, entirely funded by the fraudulent sale of my primary residence. He carried a small silver tray holding 2 steaming ceramic mugs. They were identical dark blue mugs from my own kitchen. He set the heavy tray down on the nightstand right next to my bedside lamp. He flashed me a brilliant white smile, completely devoid of genuine human emotion. He told me he had brought a very special organic vitamin tea. He claimed our mother brewed it specifically for me using rare herbal roots to give my failing body a massive burst of energy for the exhausting evening. He said the church congregation was eagerly waiting to see my brave face, and he needed me strong enough to sit in my wheelchair for at least 2 hours. I looked down at the blue ceramic mug resting closest to my hand. Thick, white steam curled up from the dark amber liquid. The smell was incredibly overpowering. It was a harsh, pungent blend of sharp peppermint and heavy ginger, entirely designed to mask something else. Underneath the aggressive herbal scent, my sharp senses detected the distinct chemical odor of industrial paint solvent. A cold, terrifying realization washed completely over my body. This was not just another standard daily dose meant to slowly weaken my respiratory system. The sheer, overwhelming strength of the chemical smell told me everything. This was the absolute final kill shot. They did not want me to simply look sick at the charity gala tonight. They wanted me to suffer a fatal collapse right there in front of 500 wealthy donors. A dramatic death on the public stage would guarantee their fraudulent medical fund would easily double its massive financial goal. They were planning to murder me on live camera to maximize their criminal profits. I kept my face perfectly blank, allowing a soft, grateful smile to touch my lips. I reached out with a violently shaking hand and wrapped my cold fingers around the warm handle of the poisoned mug. I pulled it close to my chest, thanking him for his constant loving care. Preston picked up the second identical blue mug from the silver tray, holding it casually. He took a small step back, checking his reflection in my tall closet mirror, adjusting his silk cuffs. I knew I had exactly one tiny window of opportunity to eliminate the lethal threat without blowing my entire undercover operation. I let out a sudden, sharp gasp, intentionally dropping my heavy cell phone off the edge of the mattress. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud clatter, sliding underneath the dark wooden frame of the bed. I started to panic, wildly, clutching my chest and wheezing heavily. I begged Preston to get the phone for me, claiming my severe anxiety was instantly triggered by the loud noise causing my lungs to tighten up. Preston rolled his eyes, letting out a loud sigh of pure annoyance. He set his unpoisoned mug down on the edge of the nightstand right next to my lethal cup. He complained bitterly about my constant dramatic episodes ruining his perfectly pressed tuxedo pants. He dropped heavily onto his hands and knees, completely turning his broad back to me as he aggressively reached his long arm deep under the bed frame to retrieve the phone. That was my single moment. I moved with the rapid, flawless precision of a seasoned predator. I did not make a single sound. I swiftly grabbed the handle of his safe unpoisoned tea and smoothly swapped its physical position with my deeply contaminated mug. The physical exchange took less than 2 seconds. By the time Preston stood back up holding my cell phone, the trap was completely reset. He handed the device back, wiping a smudge of dust off his expensive jacket sleeve. He immediately reached down and grabbed the dark blue mug sitting closest to the edge, entirely unaware that he had just wrapped his fingers around his own toxic death sentence. He raised the poisoned ceramic mug into the air, offering a mocking, sarcastic toast to my fading health and our massive upcoming financial success. I raised my own safe cup, mirroring his exact movement with a weak, pathetic nod. I pressed the warm rim to my lips and took a long, deep swallow of the perfectly harmless peppermint tea. Preston tipped his head back and took a massive, arrogant gulp of the industrial solvent. I watched his dark eyes widen for a fraction of a second, as the bitter, metallic taste aggressively hit the back of his throat. He grimaced slightly, pulling the mug away from his mouth, staring down at the dark, amber liquid. But his boundless ego completely overrode his basic survival instincts. He simply cleared his throat, masking his physical discomfort, complaining that our mother had made the herbal ginger blend entirely too strong. He set the half-empty toxic mug back down on the silver tray, checking his gold watch, telling me to hurry up and get dressed. He walked out of my bedroom completely blind to the terrifying reality that he had just swallowed the exact poison he bought to bury me. The luxurious tires of my father's leased sedan crunched softly against the pristine white gravel of the Oakwood Valley Country Club. The sheer scale of the Grace Fellowship Spring Gala was absolutely breathtaking to witness in person. Massive floodlights illuminated the towering columns of the main clubhouse, casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured lawns. Valet attendants in crisp, white uniforms rushed forward to open our car doors. My father hurried to the trunk to retrieve the heavy medical wheelchair they had specifically rented just for this theatrical performance. I sat perfectly still in the back seat, catching a brief glimpse of my reflection in the tinted window. The heavy theatrical makeup I had meticulously applied earlier was flawless. My skin looked completely translucent and deep purple shadows hollowed out my eyes. I looked exactly like a woman with only a few fragile days left on this earth. Richard lifted me effortlessly from the leather seat and carefully placed me into the cold metal wheelchair. He draped a thick woven blanket over my legs, making sure the fabric was arranged to make me look as frail and small as humanly possible. As he pushed me up the wide concrete ramp toward the grand double doors, a massive wave of sound washed over us. The main ballroom was entirely packed with over 500 wealthy church members wearing expensive designer evening gowns and perfectly tailored dark suits. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, bathing the entire room in a warm, expensive golden light. The second my wheelchair rolled past the heavy velvet curtains at the entrance, the loud, cheerful chatter immediately died down into a profound, heavy silence. Hundreds of heads turned simultaneously to look directly at me. It was like watching the Red Sea part in real time. The wealthy crowd slowly moved aside, creating a wide, clear path directly toward the front of the massive room. I kept my chin tucked down, allowing my shoulders to droop forward, staring blankly at my own hands resting motionless in my lap. Soft gasps and dramatic whispers echoed through the silent ballroom. I could hear women crying softly into silk handkerchiefs, completely heartbroken by the tragic physical state of the once successful real estate broker. Beatrice was waiting for us near the front stage, completely in her element. She wore that stunning dark emerald silk evening gown I had watched her admire in my bedroom mirror. When she saw me rolling down the center aisle, she immediately burst into a fresh round of flawless theatrical tears. 2 professional videographers hired specifically by the megachurch rushed forward with heavy digital cameras, hoisting them onto their shoulders to capture the devastating emotional reunion. Beatrice completely ignored the cameras, pretending they were not even there, while perfectly angling her best side toward the bright lenses. She dropped dramatically to her knees right in front of my wheelchair, the expensive emerald silk pooling beautifully on the polished wooden floor. She reached out and took my cold hands in hers, squeezing them tightly. She leaned forward and pressed a long, lingering kiss against my pale forehead. She whispered loudly enough for the sensitive microphone packs to pick up every single word, calling me her brave, precious angel. The entire congregation let out a collective heavy sigh of profound sympathy. It was an absolute masterpiece of emotional manipulation, and I was the star prop. I looked past my mother's trembling shoulders and spotted Preston standing near the main stage. He was gripping a glass of sparkling water, his knuckles completely white. He was sweating profusely. Large, damp patches were already forming under the arms of his tailored designer tuxedo, and his face looked unusually pale. The heavy dose of industrial solvent he had unknowingly swallowed in my bedroom was aggressively working its way through his central nervous system. He kept shifting his weight nervously, trying to maintain his arrogant smile, but his eyes were darting rapidly around the room. He thought it was just standard anxiety, or perhaps the massive amount of money sitting in his offshore bank account making him jumpy. He had absolutely no idea his diaphragm was actively starting to paralyze itself from the inside out. I smiled weakly at Beatrice, forcing a single, perfect tear to roll down my heavily powdered cheek. I whispered that I loved her so much, feeding the beast exactly what it demanded. She stood back up, wiping her dry eyes, and gestured proudly toward the massive projection screens hanging directly behind the main podium. The screens were currently displaying that terrible, fraudulent medical trust website with my face plastered across the center. My right hand was buried deep underneath the thick woven blanket covering my legs. My fingers were wrapped tightly around my secure black cell phone. Hours earlier, Elias, the security contractor, had remotely breached the country club wireless network. My small digital device was currently completely synced with the massive audio-visual system controlling every single speaker and projector screen in the entire building. I was sitting directly inside the belly of the beast, completely surrounded by hundreds of people who firmly believed I was a tragic, helpless victim. My family was positioning themselves on the brightly lit stage, preparing to ask these wealthy donors for $100,000 to fund my fake medical treatments. They were completely blinded by the flashing cameras and their own massive toxic greed. I kept my breathing slow and steady, feeling the smooth glass screen of my phone waiting for the exact, perfect moment. The trap was fully loaded. The audience was entirely captivated. The hunters were confidently standing directly on top of the trapdoor. All I had to do was wait for Preston to grab the microphone, and then I would press a single button to burn their entire fraudulent kingdom straight to the ground. The senior pastor of Grace Fellowship gently tapped the top of the microphone, sending a low, heavy bass hum echoing across the massive ballroom. The quiet, sophisticated murmur of 500 wealthy guests instantly faded into complete, total silence. I sat entirely frozen in my rented metal medical wheelchair, positioned perfectly next to the elevated stage so the entire room could easily gaze upon my carefully powdered pale face. To my immediate left sat the city mayor, swirling a glass of expensive imported champagne alongside several prominent local judges and wealthy commercial real estate developers I used to fiercely compete against. They were all staring at me with a profound, suffocating pity that felt heavier than the thick, woven blanket resting on my legs. The massive crystal chandeliers slowly dimmed, leaving only the bright, harsh, theatrical spotlights shining directly onto the polished wooden platform. Beatrice stood right behind my chair, resting her cold hands heavily on my sloping shoulders, occasionally letting out a soft, perfectly rehearsed sob to ensure everyone sitting in the expensive VIP front row knew exactly how much she was suffering tonight. The pastor spoke into the microphone using a deep, booming voice, talking at length about the incredible power of community support and the heavy, unpredictable trials that test our deeply held faith. He spent several long minutes praising my parents for their unwavering dedication before formally introducing my brother to the silent crowd, calling him a fiercely devoted son and a deeply loyal guardian to his dying sister. Preston walked slowly up the short flight of carpeted stairs toward the center podium. His tailored designer tuxedo looked absolutely immaculate, but from my vantage point I could clearly see the distinct physical signs of the toxic, industrial paint solvent finally beginning to ravage his central nervous system. His breathing was noticeably shallow and rapid. A thick layer of cold, clammy sweat coated his forehead, catching the bright, glaring reflection of the stage lights. His hands trembled slightly as he tightly gripped the outer edges of the heavy wooden podium. The wealthy audience simply assumed he was overcome with deep, raw, emotional grief. I knew the terrifying medical truth. His diaphragm was slowly starting to restrict and paralyze, but his massive, unchecked greed was forcefully pushing him through the agonizing physical pain. Preston leaned close into the microphone, letting out a long, shaky breath that carried clearly throughout the silent country club. He looked down at me, a masterfully crafted expression of pure, absolute heartbreak painted across his handsome face. He began his elaborate speech by describing the beautiful, unbreakable bond we allegedly shared as siblings. He boldly lied to 500 influential people, spinning a completely fabricated narrative about how we grew up fiercely protecting each other, and how he had always been my absolute biggest supporter in every endeavor. He talked extensively about my highly successful real estate brokerage, praising my fierce independence and my relentless work ethic, while tragically lamenting how quickly a perfectly healthy, beautiful life can be destroyed by a mysterious, cruel illness. He paused at the exact right moment, perfectly timing his emotional break for maximum dramatic impact. He reached up with a trembling hand and wiped a completely fake tear from his eye. Women throughout the sprawling ballroom began softly crying into their expensive silk napkins, completely captivated by his spectacular theatrical performance. He was playing the role of the shattered protective older brother with absolute flawless precision. Then he seamlessly transitioned into the dark financial phase of his grand public scam. His voice took on a heavy, solemn tone as he looked directly at the mayor and the wealthy business elites sitting at the front tables. He told them in a hushed, dramatic whisper that terminal illness does not just break a loving family emotionally, it destroys them entirely financially. He openly praised our parents standing right behind my wheelchair, boldly claiming that Richard and Beatrice had unhesitatingly emptied their entire retirement savings to keep me comfortable and alive. He looked the weeping crowd dead in the eye and stated that just 3 weeks ago, my parents bravely wired $27,000 in a single afternoon to cover my emergency hospital bills without a second thought. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of that specific, calculated lie made my blood run completely cold beneath my skin. He was standing on a brightly lit stage in front of my professional peers, publicly claiming that the massive sum of money he forcibly stole from my house, down payment to pay off his illegal underground gambling debts, was actually a holy parental sacrifice made on my behalf. The sprawling ballroom was entirely captivated. You could clearly hear a single pin drop in the massive, luxurious space. Preston aggressively capitalized on the heavy emotional momentum, pushing relentlessly toward his ultimate financial goal. He explained to the crowd that my mysterious respiratory condition required incredibly expensive experimental treatments and highly specialized out-of-state oxygen therapies that traditional health insurance networks completely refused to cover. He raised both of his hands in a grand gesture of humble desperation, begging the wealthy congregation to open their generous hearts and their massive bank accounts tonight. He officially announced the launch of the Clara Medical Trust Fund, explicitly stating that their ambitious goal for the evening was to raise $100,000 in immediate cash donations to secure my final chance at survival. He pointed a shaking, sweating finger toward the massive digital projection screens hanging high above the wooden stage, urging the crowd to pull out their phones, scan the digital codes, and donate generously to save his precious sister's life. He smiled, a tragic, heroic smile, waiting for the massive flood of money to begin, completely unaware that I was already holding the detonator. Preston lowered his head, letting the heavy silence of the massive ballroom work its financial magic. Hundreds of wealthy donors were already retrieving their glowing smartphones to scan the fraudulent digital donation codes. The trap was fully baited, and the incredibly lucrative snare was set. I looked down at the thick woven blanket covering my legs, feeling the rough texture against my fingertips. For 3 agonizing weeks, I had played the pathetic role of the dying, broken daughter. I had swallowed their bitter insults, endured their suffocating psychological torture, and laid perfectly still while they actively looted my life. The time for hiding in the dark was officially over. I took a deep breath, filling my healthy lungs with the cool air of the country club. I gripped the cold metal armrests of the medical wheelchair and pushed myself upright. The heavy blanket slipped off my lap, falling to the polished wooden floor with a soft thud. I did not stumble. I did not shake or lean against the metal wheels for physical support. I stood tall and perfectly straight, squaring my shoulders. A sudden, sharp gasp erupted from the mayor sitting at the table, directly to my left. That single sound acted like a massive physical shockwave, ripping through the silent room. 500 heads whipped around to stare at me in complete disbelief. The wealthy women who had just been weeping into their napkins froze still, their wet eyes wide with pure shock. I stepped away from the metal chair, smoothing down the dark fabric of my elegant black dress. I began to walk down the center aisle toward the brightly lit stage. My strides were incredibly smooth, steady, and devoid of any physical weakness. I was no longer the fragile ghost they had been weeping for all evening. I was a towering column of cold fury, walking straight into the bright, glaring spotlight. Beatrice was standing at the edge of the elevated platform, her face still arranged in that perfect, tragic mask of maternal sorrow. As she watched me casually ascend the short flight of carpeted stairs, the fake, warm color aggressively drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a terrified, hollow mannequin. Her jaw literally dropped open, but no sound managed to escape her throat. She instinctively took a trembling step backward, her expensive emerald silk dress catching on the edge of a heavy speaker cabinet. Richard stood frozen right next to her, his eyes darting frantically between my steady, healthy legs and the massive crowd of wealthy, influential people watching our every move. They had no contingency plan for this moment. I walked directly up to the center wooden podium, where my golden child brother was currently clinging to the heavy microphone stand like a drowning man clutching a life raft. The toxic industrial paint solvent he had arrogantly swallowed in my bedroom was ravaging his system now. Thick beads of cold sweat were dripping down his pale face, soaking into his crisp silk bow tie. His chest heaved with shallow, desperate breaths as his paralyzed diaphragm struggled to pull in oxygen. I stepped into his personal space, staring directly into his terrified, dark eyes. He looked at me with profound horror, unable to comprehend how I was standing there looking so powerful, while his own body was rapidly shutting down. I reached out with a perfectly steady hand and gently pried the heavy black microphone directly out of his trembling, slick fingers. He was far too weak and shocked to offer even a single ounce of physical resistance. I turned my back on my defeated family and looked out over the massive sea of stunned faces. The mayor was standing up from his chair, his champagne glass forgotten on the white linen tablecloth. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed across the massive silent ballroom, clear, steady, and ringing with undeniable authority. I told the crowd that my brother was actually right about one specific thing tonight. He truly loves my money. A heavy wave of profound confusion washed over the audience. I did not give them a single second to process the statement. I reached into the pocket of my black dress and pulled out my secure, encrypted phone. I pressed the bright red activation button overriding the massive audio-visual system of the entire country club. The high-definition projector screens hanging directly behind me flickered violently for a fraction of a second. The fraudulent charity website with the glowing donation links vanished. It was instantly replaced by the crystal-clear hidden camera footage Elias had installed in my kitchen. The screens were massive, making my mother look like a towering giant. The congregation watched in horrified silence as the video showed Beatrice casually pulling a medical syringe out of her expensive leather purse. They watched her perfectly manicured hands meticulously inject the clear industrial solvent directly into my daily meal prep containers. The collective gasp from the wealthy guests was deafening, but the devastating evidence did not stop there. The video flawlessly transitioned to the footage of my mother coating my red plastic asthma inhaler, with the deadly toxic chemical intentionally guaranteeing my destruction. Before the massive crowd could even process the visual horror of a mother actively murdering her own daughter, the heavy surround sound speakers mounted across the ballroom violently roared to life. The pristine acoustics of the country club amplified the crystal-clear audio recording I had captured from my dark bedroom. The loud, arrogant laughter of my brother Preston filled the room. The wealthy church members listened in pure disgust as Preston gleefully bragged about stealing my antique silver and cashing in my vintage diamond jewelry. They heard my own mother dismiss my impending death coldly, stating that I would not need my designer bags where I was going. And finally, the audio captured Preston loudly celebrating the fraudulent interstate sale of my primary residence using the forged legal documents. The devastating impact of the raw, undeniable truth was catastrophic. The public execution was completely flawless. The holy, saintly facade my parents had meticulously built over decades was instantly pulverized into dust in front of the exact people they desperately wanted to impress. I stood completely still on the bright stage watching the profound horror wash over the faces of the senior pastor and the wealthy ministry leaders. My family was exposed, trapped under the blinding, glaring spotlights with nowhere to run. They had desperately wanted a dramatic public stage to secure their final massive payday. I had simply accommodated their greed, turning their beautiful, elegant charity gala into their ultimate terrifying digital graveyard. The sheer volume of the uproar that exploded inside the Oakwood Valley Country Club was unlike anything I had ever heard in my entire life. It was not a collective gasp of mild surprise. It was a massive, violent eruption of pure, high society outrage. 500 wealthy donors, commercial investors, and prominent community leaders simultaneously realized they were being aggressively conned by the very people they had just been weeping for. The massive crystal chandeliers hanging high above us literally seemed to vibrate from the sudden explosive noise. Men in tailored designer tuxedos were shouting in absolute disgust, while women in expensive evening gowns covered their mouths in sheer horror, pointing their trembling fingers directly at my parents. The senior pastor of Grace Fellowship, the man who had just delivered a passionate 10-minute sermon praising my family, looked as though he had been physically struck by a bolt of lightning. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of ash gray, as he stared up at the massive projection screens playing the undeniable footage of my mother injecting lethal chemical poison into my daily meals. He stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the heavy wooden podium, and dropped his leather-bound Bible straight onto the polished floor. Beatrice finally snapped out of her paralyzed state when the crystal-clear audio of Preston, bragging about stealing my vintage diamonds, echoed loudly through the massive surround sound speakers. She looked out at the furious, screaming crowd and realized her perfectly constructed holy facade was completely destroyed. The massive social empire she had spent decades meticulously building was burning to the ground in real time, right in front of her eyes. Pure animal survival instinct finally kicked in. She grabbed the heavy silk skirt of her expensive emerald evening gown, and clumsily turned toward the side exit leading to the outdoor patio. She took exactly 3 frantic steps before her towering designer heels betrayed her. Perhaps the sheer terrifying reality of the moment finally overwhelmed her nervous system, or perhaps she was attempting one final, desperate theatrical performance to garner sympathy from the angry mob. Either way, her eyes rolled completely back into her head, and she collapsed hard onto the polished wooden floor. She hit the ground with a heavy, sickening thud, her expensive emerald dress tangling awkwardly around her legs. Richard did not even bend down to help his unconscious wife. My father simply stood there, completely rigid, staring blankly at the screaming crowd, his jaw hanging completely open in absolute shock. But the absolute best part of the evening was just beginning. The heavy double doors leading into the massive country club catering kitchen suddenly burst violently open. I had specifically arranged for Agent Hayes and a massive joint task force of federal agents and local police officers to stage themselves quietly among the catering staff hours before the gala even began. They poured into the beautiful ballroom, wearing dark tactical vests over their crisp dress shirts, the bold yellow letters spelling out their federal agency flashing under the bright chandeliers. The wealthy crowd immediately parted like the Red Sea, once again scrambling desperately to get out of the way of the armed authorities. Agent Hayes walked straight down the center aisle, his face an absolute mask of cold, professional fury. He did not politely ask for permission to interrupt the charity event. He marched directly up the carpeted stairs and onto the main stage, completely ignoring the unconscious woman lying near the large speaker cabinets. Preston was still clutching the edge of the wooden podium, sweating profusely from the toxic industrial solvent currently ravaging his own nervous system. When he saw the federal agents swarming the brightly lit platform, his massive, arrogant ego completely short-circuited his rational brain. He actually thought he could somehow fight his way out of a room filled with 500 angry witnesses and heavily armed federal authorities. He let out a loud, desperate yell and lunged toward the opposite side of the stage, shoving a local police officer hard in the chest. It was the absolute worst mistake he could have possibly made. 2 massive federal agents immediately flanked him, grabbing his expensive tuxedo jacket and violently twisting his arms tightly behind his back. Preston thrashed wildly, kicking his polished dress shoes in the air, completely losing his balance. The agents expertly used his own aggressive momentum against him, tackling him forcefully off the elevated stage. They crashed directly into a massive, expensive display of imported spring flowers arranged beautifully near the front VIP tables. Tall glass vases shattered, sending cold water and crushed white lilies flying everywhere, as Preston was firmly pinned face down into the wet carpet. Agent Hayes stepped right up to the center podium, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He grabbed the microphone that I had left resting on the wooden surface, ensuring that every single person in the massive ballroom could hear the absolute final nail being driven into my family's coffin. His deep, authoritative voice boomed over the speakers, cutting entirely through the chaotic screaming of the crowd. He announced that Preston and Beatrice were formally under arrest for massive federal crimes. He did not vaguely list the charges. He loudly and meticulously detailed every single horrific financial and violent act they had committed against me. He announced the fraudulent wire transfer of my $27,000 house down payment to cover illicit underground gambling debts. He loudly declared the forged power of attorney used to illegally sell my primary residence across state lines. And finally, he announced the absolute highest charge of all, attempted first-degree murder using lethal industrial chemicals. The distinct metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs closing tightly around Preston's wrists echoed sharply through the microphone. Agent Hayes began reading them their Miranda rights, his calm, steady voice serving as the ultimate death knell for their entire, arrogant existence. I stood perfectly still near the edge of the stage, watching my golden child brother, sobbing uncontrollably into the crushed white lilies, while my mother was being roughly lifted off the floor by 2 female officers. The massive charity gala they had specifically organized to fund their lavish lifestyle had successfully transformed into their own spectacular public execution. The suffocating nightmare was finally completely over, and I was the only one left standing in the warm, golden light. The legal aftermath was swift and absolutely merciless. Unlike the slow, agonizing death my family had meticulously planned for me, the federal justice system operates with a cold mechanical efficiency. The massive mountain of undeniable digital evidence we handed over to the prosecutors left absolutely no room for negotiations or clever plea deals. There were no lengthy, dramatic courtroom trials or tearful testimonies needed. When you are caught on high-definition video actively poisoning your own daughter while simultaneously committing interstate wire fraud, the brilliant defense attorneys suddenly refused to take your phone calls. The same wealthy church community that had wept for my mother just days prior immediately turned their backs, shutting off their phones and violently distancing themselves from the massive scandal. The mayor, who had been sitting right next to me at the gala, released a very strong public statement completely condemning their actions. My family was instantly radioactive. Preston was the very first to fall. My brother stood before a federal judge looking completely unrecognizable. The tailored designer tuxedos and the arrogant smirk were entirely gone, completely replaced by a standard orange jumpsuit, and the terrifying realization that his golden life was permanently over. Because he had physically crossed state lines to commit the fraudulent real estate transaction, and because the financial crimes were directly linked to a premeditated murder attempt, the judge threw the absolute maximum book at him. Preston was officially sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, without the possibility of early parole. He will spend the next 2 decades entirely locked away in a small concrete cell, completely cut off from the luxury and privilege he felt so aggressively entitled to. Furthermore, the massive underground gambling syndicates he owed money to are well aware of exactly where he is currently residing. He traded a life of extreme comfort for a daily fight for basic survival. Beatrice faced her own devastating judgment exactly 1 week later. She tried to play the fragile elderly woman routine in the courtroom, crying real tears this time, and begging the judge for leniency due to her supposed failing health. She pleaded that she was just a confused mother trying to help her children. But the judge had already watched the hidden camera footage of her methodically injecting industrial solvent into my meals with the cold precision of a seasoned assassin. Her theatrical performance completely failed to generate a single ounce of sympathy. My mother was handed a massive 15-year federal prison sentence. For a woman who was obsessed with her pristine public image and her elite social standing, the loss of her absolute freedom was a fate worse than death. She was entirely stripped of her expensive silk dresses, her heavy gold jewelry, and her highly coveted seat at the local country club. She is now just another federal inmate completely forgotten by the wealthy friends she tried so desperately to impress. Her days of manipulating the church congregation are officially over. My father, Richard, managed to avoid a direct prison sentence simply because he did not physically participate in the chemical poisoning or the forged real estate wire transfers. However, his punishment was arguably just as poetic and entirely devastating. He refused to believe his perfect family was truly ruined, so he stubbornly attempted to fight the federal government. He completely liquidated every single asset he owned and took out massive predatory loans just to hire expensive defense attorneys for Beatrice and Preston. The astronomical legal fees completely drained his bank accounts in a matter of months, leaving him entirely bankrupt. The bank swiftly foreclosed on the large suburban family home where they had once hosted their grand Sunday dinners. Richard is now living alone in a tiny rundown rented apartment on the far edge of town. He is completely ostracized from Grace Fellowship and entirely shunned by polite society, forced to live out the rest of his miserable days completely consumed by total financial ruin and absolute public shame. He has absolutely nothing left to his name. As for me, the healing process was slow but incredibly profound. Once the toxic industrial chemicals were entirely flushed from my bloodstream, my respiratory system fully recovered. I took several months off from my demanding real estate brokerage to travel, breathe the clean ocean air, and completely rebuild my physical strength. Because the sale of my primary residence was immediately voided, I never actually lost my beautiful home. My elite attorney, Veronica, relentlessly pursued massive civil damages against my parents' remaining estate and the predatory cash-buying firm that facilitated the illegal sale. I successfully retrieved my entire $27,000 life savings, down to the very last cent, plus a massive financial settlement for the extreme emotional and physical distress they intentionally caused me. I used a portion of that settlement to completely remodel my property, adding a beautiful, sprawling wraparound porch and a lush, vibrant garden. I finally created the absolute perfect sanctuary I always deserved, without lifting a single finger to help the people who tried to destroy me. I am sitting on that very porch right now, watching the warm evening sun slowly dip below the quiet suburban skyline. I have a steaming cup of fresh herbal tea resting on the table beside me, and I can breathe perfectly deeply without a single trace of pain in my chest. My real estate business is more successful than ever, and my life is completely filled with genuine peace. I learned the absolute hardest lesson a person can possibly learn, but I survived to tell the tale. Blood might make you related, but loyalty makes you family. Never let the people who share your DNA think they have the right to dig your grave. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you found this journey as unbelievable as I did, please hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and leave a comment below to help the channel grow. Stay safe out there, trust your instincts, and I will see you in the next video.